Hey guys, today I will explain the DB Cooper hijacking case. Let's start. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a quiet man walked into Portland International Airport. It was a gray, drizzling day in Oregon, the kind of sky that felt heavy and low, as if winter had already taken hold. Travelers hurried through the terminal with coats over their arms and briefcases in their hands, focused on getting home for the holiday. No one noticed the man. He appeared ordinary in every way. He was in his mid-40s, maybe early 50s. He wore a dark business suit, a white shirt, and a thin black tie held in place with a simple tie clip. His hair was neatly combed. He carried a small black briefcase. He did not look nervous. He did not look rushed. He looked like a businessman on a short trip. At the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter, he purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. The ticket cost $20. He paid in cash. In 1971, there were no ID checks for domestic flights, no security lines, no metal detectors, no body scans. You could walk straight from the curb to the gate in minutes. Flight 305 was scheduled to depart at 2:50 p.m. It was a Boeing 727, a common aircraft at the time, designed for short trips like the one between Portland and Seattle. The flight would last less than 30 minutes. There were 36 passengers on board that day, along with 6 crew members. Dan Cooper took his seat in the last row of the plane, seat 18C, near the rear stairs. It was not a random choice, but no one knew that yet. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the cloudy sky at 2:50 p.m., the flight attendants began their routine service. Among them was a 23-year-old attendant named Florence Schaffner. She was young, experienced, and used to dealing with all kinds of passengers. A few minutes after takeoff, Cooper handed her a folded piece of paper. At first, she assumed it was a phone number. That happened often enough, men slipping notes to flight attendants. She tucked it into her pocket without reading it. That's when he leaned toward her and said in a calm, steady voice, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." There was no panic in his voice, no anger, just quiet certainty. Florence slowly opened the note. Inside, written in neat block letters, were words she would never forget. He claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted $200,000 in cash. He wanted 4 parachutes, and he wanted a fuel truck waiting in Seattle to refuel the plane. She felt the air leave her lungs. Trying to stay calm, she sat beside him. He opened his briefcase slightly. Inside, she saw what looked like red cylinders attached to wires and a battery. It was enough to convince her that he was not bluffing. He did not shout. He did not wave a weapon. He did not threaten anyone directly. He simply gave instructions. She walked to the cockpit and informed the captain, William Scott. The cockpit door closed. The mood on the flight changed, though the passengers had no idea why. The crew contacted air traffic control in Seattle. The FBI was notified almost immediately. The plane continued toward Seattle, circling the city while authorities gathered the ransom money and parachutes. On board, Cooper remained composed. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He smoked cigarettes. He spoke politely. At one point, he even paid for his drink and requested change. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear rushed. The passengers sat quietly, unaware that history was unfolding just a few rows behind them. On the ground, the FBI scrambled to collect $200,000 in cash. It was a large amount in 1971, equivalent to more than $1 million today. The money was gathered in $20 bills. Agents carefully recorded the serial numbers of each bill, hoping it might help them later. As the plane circled Seattle in the fading afternoon light, the tension grew. The sun began to set. Clouds thickened, rain fell steadily. Inside the cabin, Cooper quietly explained his next steps to the flight crew. Once they landed, he wanted the passengers released. After receiving the money and parachutes, he'd give further instructions. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The plane taxied to a remote area of the runway. The cabin lights were dimmed. Outside, police vehicles and FBI agents waited at a distance. They did not want to provoke him. One by one, the demands were met. A ground crew member delivered the ransom money in a canvas bag. 4 parachutes were brought on board, 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. Cooper examined them carefully. He seemed knowledgeable. He rejected 1 parachute at first, then accepted it after adjustments. Once he was satisfied, he allowed the 36 passengers to leave. They walked down the stairs into the cold evening air, confused but unharmed. Many of them did not yet understand how close they had come to danger. Inside the plane, only the crew remained: Captain Scott, First Officer William Radixak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and 2 flight attendants, including Tina Mucklow, who now sat near Cooper. The next phase of his plan was about to begin. He gave the pilots specific instructions. He wanted to fly to Mexico City. The plane must fly low, no higher than 10,000 feet. It must fly slow, around 170 knots. The landing gear should remain down. The flaps should be set at 15 degrees, and the cabin must remain unpressurized. These were unusual instructions. Very specific, very technical. The pilots informed him that they would need to refuel before heading south. He agreed. As the aircraft refueled on the tarmac, the rain continued to fall. The sky was now completely dark. The wind picked up. Inside the cabin, Cooper calmly tied the money bag around his waist. He put on a parachute. At 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off again, heading south into the night. The cabin was nearly empty now, just a handful of crew members and the hijacker. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper instructed Tina Mucklow to enter the cockpit and close the door behind her. He wanted to be alone. The cockpit crew could not see him. They could not hear him clearly over the roar of the engines. They had no idea what he was doing in the back of the plane. Then, at approximately 8:00 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. It indicated that the rear air stair, the unique staircase at the back of the Boeing 727, had been deployed. The plane suddenly experienced a slight upward movement, as if weight had shifted. The pilots looked at each other. In the darkness, somewhere over the forests of Washington State, at 10,000 feet, in heavy rain and freezing wind, Dan Cooper had made his move. And from that moment on, he vanished. The night swallowed him whole. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere above the dense forests of southwest Washington, the Boeing 727 shuddered slightly. The cockpit crew felt a sudden change in air pressure and a subtle shift in balance. The rear air stair was fully deployed now, hanging down into the darkness. Rain and freezing wind rushed into the open tail section of the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Scott kept his hands steady on the controls. He did not panic. None of them did. They were professionals, but they all understood what had just happened. Dan Cooper had jumped. Outside, the world below was pitch black. Thick clouds covered the moon. The forests beneath were vast, wild, and unforgiving. Miles of trees, rivers, hills, and empty land stretching toward the Columbia River. It was cold. The temperature at 10,000 feet hovered near freezing. Winds reached up to 100 miles per hour. If Cooper had truly stepped off that staircase into the night, he had done so blind. The pilots could not see him. They could not turn back immediately. Their orders were to continue toward Reno, Nevada, where they would land and allow authorities to inspect the aircraft. Military jets had been scrambled to follow them, but even those experienced pilots had difficulty maintaining visual contact in the stormy darkness. One jet flew above the 727. Another flew below. Neither saw a man falling through the sky. There was no parachute silhouette, no flare, no signal, just blackness. When Flight 305 finally landed safely in Reno at 10:15 p.m., law enforcement agents stormed the plane. Guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the cabin. The rear stairs were down. The cabin was empty. Dan Cooper was gone. On one of the seats, investigators found a black clip-on tie and a tie clip. He had removed it before the jump. It lay there quietly like a forgotten detail in a much larger mystery. They also found 2 of the parachutes left behind. He had taken only one main chute and one reserve. Or at least that was the assumption. The money was gone, the bomb was gone, and the man who called himself Dan Cooper had disappeared into the Pacific Northwest night. Within hours, the largest manhunt in FBI history at that time had begun. Agents calculated the likely drop zone based on flight speed, wind direction, and the time the air stair had deployed. They narrowed the search area to a stretch of land near the small town of Ariel, Washington, a rugged region of forests and rivers not far from Mount St. Helens. It was the worst possible place to land. The terrain was harsh, trees stood tall and thick. The ground was uneven, muddy, filled with sharp rocks and dense brush. Rivers cut through the wilderness with strong currents. November storms soaked everything. If Cooper had landed safely, he would have needed skill, strength, and extraordinary luck to survive the night. Search teams moved in quickly. FBI agents, local police, military personnel, hundreds of men combed through miles of wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead. Soldiers marched through the trees in lines. They searched riverbanks. They checked roads. They questioned locals. Nothing. No parachute. No body. No ransom money. No footprints. It was as if he had dissolved into the rain. In the days that followed, investigators began digging into the identity of Dan Cooper. The name itself raised questions. No missing persons reports matched him. No records of a man by that name purchasing a ticket fit the description. It soon became clear that Dan Cooper was an alias. Interestingly, there was a French-language comic book popular in Europe at the time called Dan Cooper. It featured a fictional Royal Canadian Air Force pilot involved in daring adventures. The comic was not widely known in the United States. This detail would later fuel speculation that the hijacker might have had some connection to Canada or Europe. Witnesses described him consistently. Mid-40s, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, approximately 170 to 180 pounds, olive complexion, brown eyes, dark hair combed neatly. He spoke calmly without noticeable accent. Some thought he might have had military experience. He seemed familiar with aircraft mechanics. He knew that the Boeing 727 had a rear staircase that could be lowered mid-flight, a feature unique to that aircraft model. That detail troubled investigators. This was not random. He had chosen that plane for a reason. The Boeing 727's rear air stair allowed passengers to board from the back without airport equipment. But it also meant someone could exit from the back even during flight. Most aircraft did not allow that. Cooper had requested specific flight settings that made a jump possible. Low altitude, slow speed, landing gear down. He understood aerodynamics. He knew what he was doing. Or at least it seemed that way. But then came another puzzling detail. One of the parachutes he had taken was a civilian sport parachute. The reserve parachute, however, was a non-functional training chute, sewn shut for instructional purposes. It could not deploy had he known that. If he was truly an experienced skydiver, he might have recognized the difference immediately. Yet he took it anyway. Why? Was it a mistake, or did he never intend to use it? The FBI lined toward a grim conclusion. Even skilled parachutists avoid jumping into total darkness during a storm over unfamiliar terrain, wearing business shoes and a suit, carrying a heavy bag of cash. It was not just dangerous. It was nearly suicidal. Many agents believed Cooper had died in the forest that night, his body simply lost in the vast wilderness, perhaps buried under snow, perhaps swept away by a river. Perhaps decomposed before anyone could find him. But there was a problem with that theory. No body was ever found. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The FBI tracked serial numbers of the ransom bills nationwide. Banks were alerted. Casinos were monitored. Every suspicious $20 bill was examined. Nothing. The money did not surface. It was as if the cash had vanished along with the man. In early 1972, search efforts officially scaled back. The forests returned to silence. The rain fell. Winter deepened. Life moved on. But the legend had already begun to grow. The press gave him a new name, D.B. Cooper, due to an early reporting error that confused him with a suspect named D.B. The mistake stuck. And in that small misprint, a myth was born. D.B. Cooper, a polite, calm hijacker who asked for bourbon, paid for his drink, and vanished into the night with $200,000. Was he a criminal mastermind who survived against impossible odds, or a desperate man who made a fatal leap into darkness? As the FBI dug deeper into his background, another unsettling question began to surface. What if this was not his first time planning something like this? And what if someone somewhere knew exactly who he was? As the weeks turned into months and the headlines slowly faded from the front pages, the mystery of D.B. Cooper did not disappear. Instead, it grew. Inside FBI headquarters, the case was given a formal name, NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. It would become one of the longest and most expensive investigations in the Bureau's history. Hundreds of agents were assigned at different times. Thousands of tips flooded in from across the country. Every letter, every phone call, every rumor had to be checked, and the rumors were endless. Some people claimed Cooper had been a former military paratrooper, trained to jump in harsh conditions. Others insisted he had been a commercial airline employee who knew the Boeing 727 inside and out. A few believed he was a CIA operative testing airport security during the Cold War. Conspiracy theories began forming almost immediately, but the FBI focused on evidence. They studied the tie he left behind, a simple black clip-on tie with a narrow tie clip. At first glance, it seemed unimportant, but years later, forensic testing would reveal microscopic particles embedded in the fabric. Tiny traces of rare metals, titanium, and other exotic alloys, materials not common in everyday environments during the early 1970s. This detail would later suggest something intriguing. Perhaps Cooper had worked in aerospace manufacturing, or in a high-tech industry involving specialized metals. That could explain his knowledge of aircraft systems. It could explain his calm confidence, but in 1971, forensic science was limited. The technology to analyze such small particles did not yet exist. So the tie was placed into evidence storage, waiting quietly for decades. Meanwhile, agents reconstructed the flight path again and again. Using radar data, wind speed calculations, and pilot testimony, they tried to narrow down the jump zone. The plane had been traveling south at approximately 170 knots. Winds from the southwest had pushed against it. Heavy rain reduced visibility. The estimated drop area shifted slightly each time new calculations were made. The likely zone stretched across a remote region near the Lewis River, close to Ariel and Lake Merwin in Washington state. Search teams returned in the spring of 1972 when the snow melted. Helicopters scanned treetops, divers searched rivers, ground crews walked mile after mile through thick brush. They found nothing. No torn parachute tangled in trees, no skeletal remains. No bundle of money caught in the mud, nothing. The lack of evidence became its own kind of evidence. Some agents began to believe Cooper had not landed where they thought. Perhaps he had jumped later than estimated. Perhaps he had stayed on the stairs longer than expected. Perhaps he had drifted miles away from the predicted zone, or perhaps he had never jumped at all. There was a brief theory suggesting that Cooper might have lowered the stairs as a distraction and somehow hidden inside the aircraft before landing in Reno. But thorough inspections of the plane eliminated that possibility. There was simply nowhere to hide. He had jumped. The question remained, did he survive? Former military parachutists weighed in. Some said the jump was possible but extremely risky. Others insisted it was nearly impossible under those conditions. He wore loafers, a business suit, no helmet, no goggles, no altimeter. The wind would have been brutal, the rain freezing against his face. At 10,000 feet, oxygen levels were lower. He carried a heavy bag of cash weighing over 20 pounds. And yet he had specifically requested 4 parachutes. Why 4? The FBI believed this was strategic. By asking for multiple parachutes, Cooper made it seem as though he might take a hostage with him. That would discourage authorities from sabotaging the equipment. It showed forethought. It showed intelligence. He had also chosen nighttime. A daytime jump would have made him visible. Night gave him cover, but it also increased danger. This balance between recklessness and careful planning confused investigators. Then there was the money. The FBI had recorded every serial number from the $200,000 ransom. Over 10,000 individual bills. They were entered into a national database. Banks and casinos were alerted. If even one bill surfaced, it could lead to a breakthrough. Years passed. Not a single verified ransom bill appeared in circulation. That detail was haunting. If Cooper survived, why didn't he spend the money? Was he waiting? Or was he dead, the cash buried somewhere in the wilderness? In the mid-1970s, the case began attracting amateur investigators. Journalists dug into potential suspects. One of the earliest was a man named Richard Floyd McCoy. In 1972, just months after Cooper's hijacking, McCoy hijacked a similar Boeing 727 using almost the same method. He demanded money, parachuted from the rear stairs, and was later caught. The similarities were striking. McCoy had military parachute training. He resembled Cooper physically. He used a similar ransom demand. Many believed he was the same man, but there were differences. Witnesses from Flight 305 said McCoy did not match Cooper's face exactly. McCoy was younger. And when McCoy was captured, his fingerprints did not match the partial prints found on Cooper's aircraft. The FBI officially ruled him out. Still, the public remained fascinated. The idea of a polite, intelligent hijacker who vanished without a trace captured the imagination of the country. Unlike other criminals, Cooper had not hurt anyone. He had not fired a weapon. He had not panicked. He had simply stepped into the storm and disappeared. Some people even began to see him as a strange kind of anti-hero, a symbol of rebellion during a time of political distrust and social unrest in America. But to the FBI, he was not a legend. He was an unsolved crime. Behind the scenes, agents continued interviewing suspects quietly for years. Thousands of names were considered. Men reported missing after 1971 were investigated. Military records were examined. Aviation employees were questioned. Each lead eventually collapsed. Some suspects had strong motives but lacked skydiving experience. Others had parachuting skills but no clear connection to the ransom money. A few had suspicious behavior but airtight alibis. The case file grew thicker. Boxes of documents filled evidence rooms. And yet the man himself remained a ghost. Then in 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, something unexpected happened, something that would shock investigators and breathe new life into the mystery. A young boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River stumbled upon a decaying bundle of $20 bills. The serial numbers matched the ransom money. For the first time in nearly a decade, there was physical proof that at least part of the cash had survived. But how did it get there? Had Cooper drowned, his money washing downstream? Had someone buried it deliberately, and if some of the money surfaced, where was the rest? That single discovery would raise more questions than answers, and push the case into an even deeper and more puzzling chapter. On a quiet February afternoon in 1980, nearly 9 years after DB, Cooper vanished into the storm. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the banks of the Columbia River. It was a family camping trip near a place called Tina Bar, about 20 miles northwest of Portland. The river moved slowly that day, gray and wide under a winter sky. Nothing about the moment felt historic. Nothing suggested that one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history was about to resurface. Brian was simply playing. As he dug into the sand to build a small campfire pit, his shovel hit something unusual: paper. Not just one piece, but several, clumped together in thick, muddy stacks. He brushed away more sand and uncovered 3 bundles of decaying $20 bills, held together with deteriorating rubber bands. At first, no one understood what they had found. But when the bills were examined closely, something incredible became clear. The serial numbers matched the ransom money from the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Nearly $5,800 in $20 bills, part of the original $200,000, had been buried along the Columbia River for almost a decade. The discovery electrified the FBI. After years of silence, years of empty forests and dead lids, there was finally something solid, something real. Agents rushed to the scene. The sand was carefully sifted. The area was cordoned off. Investigators tried to determine how the money ended up there, but almost immediately, the find created more confusion than clarity. Tina Bar was not within the original primary search zone. Based on flight path calculations, Cooper was believed to have jumped somewhere northeast of the river, in heavily wooded terrain near Ariel, Washington. The Columbia River location was miles away from where authorities thought he had landed. How did the money get there? There were several theories. One possibility was that Cooper had landed somewhere near a tributary that flowed into the Columbia River. If he had drowned during the jump, perhaps the money bag broke open and some bills drifted downstream over time. But there was a problem with that idea. The bills were found in 3 distinct bundles, still partially bound together. They were not scattered randomly. They were grouped, almost deliberately placed. And forensic analysis revealed something even stranger. The rubber bands around the money had deteriorated in a way that suggested the bundles had not been exposed to constant water movement for 9 years. Instead, it appeared they may have been buried relatively soon after the hijacking and then covered by layers of sediment over time. Some experts believe the money may have been intentionally buried. But by whom? If Cooper survived, why bury only a small portion of the cash and never retrieve it? If someone else found the money earlier, why leave most of it behind? Investigators tested sediment layers, studied river currents, and examined flood patterns from the 1970s. Some suggested that dredging operations in the river could have shifted the money from another location. Others argued that natural erosion and seasonal flooding might explain its movement. Still, nothing lined up perfectly. The rest of the ransom money, over $194,000, never surfaced. Not in banks, not in casinos, not in black markets, not in criminal investigations. The FBI renewed its efforts. They re-interviewed suspects. They re-examined flight data. They revisited theories that had been dismissed years earlier. But the 1980 discovery did something else. It changed the psychological tone of the case. Before the money was found, many agents believed Cooper had likely died during the jump. The wilderness was brutal. The conditions were severe. Survival seemed unlikely, but the discovery suggested something more complicated. If Cooper had died immediately after landing, how did some of the money travel so far south and west? If he drowned in a river, why were the bundles found buried rather than scattered? And if he survived, why was only a small fraction ever discovered? The public fascination returned in full force. Television specials revisited the mystery. Newspapers printed diagrams of the flight path. Amateur investigators formed groups dedicated to solving the case, and suspects continued to emerge. One man who gained attention in the 1980s was Kenneth Christiansen, a former Northwest Orient flight attendant and later a purser. He had served in the military and worked for the airline. He knew the Boeing 727 well. After the hijacking, he reportedly made several unusual purchases, including property, but there was little direct evidence linking him to the crime. His physical appearance did not fully match witness descriptions, and once again, fingerprints failed to connect. Another suspect was Dwayne Weber. In 1995, his widow claimed that before his death, Weber confessed, saying, "I am Dan Cooper." She reported that he had nightmares about the hijacking and had knowledge of details not publicly known. The FBI tested Weber's DNA against evidence recovered from Cooper's tie. No match. The case remained open. Over time, small pieces of forensic evidence were re-examined as technology improved. DNA samples were extracted from the tie. Microscopic particles were analyzed more deeply. Investigators tried to build a profile not just of the crime, but of the man. Who was he psychologically? He did not appear impulsive. He did not act violently. He was calm, methodical, polite. He did not panic when things took time. He was patient while the plane circled Seattle. He seemed confident in his plan. Some experts suggested he may have been in financial trouble. Others believed he could have been motivated by resentment, perhaps against the airline industry, the government, or corporate America during a turbulent era. The early 1970s were filled with political distrust, Vietnam War tensions, and cultural shifts. Hijackings were not uncommon at the time, but Cooper's case stood apart because of the mystery. No one else had vanished like this. Years became decades. The FBI never officially closed the case, but resources gradually shifted elsewhere. New crimes emerged, new technologies developed. The world changed, yet every so often, a new suspect would rise to the surface. And every time, investigators would ask the same haunting question: did D.B. Cooper survive that jump? Or did the Columbia River hold the only silent clue to a man who miscalculated in the darkness? As more advanced forensic tools began emerging in the 2000s, the case would enter an entirely new phase, one that focused not just on where Cooper landed, but on who he truly was. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the D.B. Cooper case refused to fade into history. Instead, it evolved. What had once been a frantic manhunt through rain-soaked forests slowly transformed into a forensic puzzle, a psychological profile, and a cultural legend all at once. Advances in science offered something investigators in 1971 never had: the ability to re-examine old evidence with new eyes. And at the center of that renewed effort was something so small, so ordinary, that it had once seemed almost meaningless: the black clip-on tie left behind on seat 18C. For decades, the tie had sat in evidence storage. It was simple, inexpensive, the kind of accessory a middle-aged businessman might wear without a second thought. But as forensic technology improved, scientists began to look deeper, literally. Under powerful microscopes, they found microscopic particles embedded in the fabric. Tiny fragments of metal invisible to the naked eye: titanium, stainless steel, rare industrial compounds that were not common in everyday office environments during the early 1970s. These were materials more often associated with aerospace manufacturing, advanced engineering facilities, or specialized industrial plants. This discovery shifted the focus dramatically. If Cooper had worked in or around aerospace production, it would explain his knowledge of aircraft systems. It would explain how he knew about the Boeing 727's unique rear air stair, a feature not widely advertised to the general public. It would explain his precise flight instructions: 10,000 feet, 170 knots, flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down. Those were not random numbers. They were conditions that would make a mid-air jump possible. Someone unfamiliar with aviation would not likely know that. The tie suggested he may have spent years in environments where advanced materials and aircraft components were part of daily life. Investigators quietly explored aerospace companies active in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Boeing, of course, was headquartered in Seattle. The region was filled with engineers, machinists, technicians, and military veterans transitioning into civilian aviation work. Thousands of men matched the general physical description. Narrowing it down was nearly impossible, yet the microscopic evidence painted a picture of a man who likely worked with his hands in technical spaces, not just a desk-bound executive. The particles suggested proximity to manufacturing floors, to assembly lines, to places where metal dust floated invisibly in the air. But even as science offered clues, it also deepened the mystery. DNA testing was performed on material recovered from the tie. The sample was partial and degraded, likely contaminated over the decades. The results were inconclusive. Without a definitive DNA profile, investigators could not match Cooper to suspects with certainty. Every new scientific step forward seemed to move the case only slightly closer to clarity, and then stall again. Meanwhile, independent researchers began studying the jump itself with renewed intensity. Modern skydivers analyzed weather reports from November 24, 1971. They recreated wind patterns using computer simulations. They studied the terrain in detail, mapping possible drift paths. Some concluded that Cooper, if he jumped where originally estimated, would have landed closer to the Washable River rather than near Area. Others argued that shifting winds might have pushed him miles off course. The more data they analyzed, the more variables emerged. A small miscalculation in timing, even a few seconds difference in when he left the plane, could have changed the landing zone by miles. There was also the question of skill. Many experienced skydivers pointed out that jumping at night without proper gear was reckless. He had no helmet, no protective clothing, no goggles. The money bag was heavy and awkward. The reserve parachute he selected was sewn shut, likely unusable. Some believed this suggested he was not an expert skydiver after all. Perhaps he misunderstood the equipment. Perhaps he was confident but not truly trained. Others argued that he may have intentionally chosen the non-functional reserve because he never intended to use it. It may have been part of a calculated deception to ensure authorities provided real parachutes without tampering. Then there was the strange behavior regarding clothing. Cooper removed his tie before jumping. Why? It could have been a simple practical choice. A tie might flap violently in high winds. But it also left behind the only physical evidence investigators ever had. Did he forget it in the rush? Or did he remove it calmly, as if shedding one final piece of his ordinary identity before stepping into legend? As the case continued, one unsettling reality remained constant. No verified ransom money ever entered circulation beyond the Columbia River discovery, not in decades. In an era where criminals often make mistakes, where stolen money eventually surfaces, the silence was deafening. If Cooper survived, he either never spent the cash, destroyed it, or found a way to use it so carefully that it never triggered detection. That level of discipline would require patience and control, traits consistent with his calm demeanor on the plane. Psychologists began analyzing his personality based on behavior alone. He was composed, polite, and deliberate. He did not threaten unnecessarily. He did not display rage. He spoke quietly. He tipped his drink. These were not the actions of someone emotionally unstable in the moment. They suggested planning, control, possibly even experience operating under pressure. Some profilers speculated he may have been a veteran, perhaps trained in structured environments where calmness under stress was essential. Others wondered whether financial desperation had slowly pushed him toward a bold, one-time crime. Over the decades, more than 1,000 serious suspects were investigated. Men who disappeared after 1971, men with parachute training, men with criminal records, men whose wives suspected something unusual about that Thanksgiving evening. Each theory carried small pieces that seemed to fit and larger gaps that did not. Fingerprints did not match, DNA did not align, physical descriptions conflicted. In 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case. The Bureau stated that resources were better allocated elsewhere. The case file remained open in theory, but no new manpower would be dedicated unless significant new evidence emerged. It was not a declaration of defeat, but it was close. Yet even in suspension, the mystery refused to rest. Amateur sleuths continued combing forests. Historians re-examined flight logs. Forensic enthusiasts revisited the Thai particles with fresh curiosity. The Columbia River money discovery remained one of the most puzzling elements of all. How 3 bundles of cash traveled, settled, and survived for nearly a decade without clear explanation continued to challenge every neat conclusion. And so the story lingered in a strange place between fact and folklore. A man boarded a plane in a business suit. He asked for $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He drank bourbon. He lowered the rear stairs at 10,000 feet, and he stepped into the night. No body, no confirmed sighting, no confession. Only questions layered year after year, like sediment along the Columbia River bank. But perhaps the most haunting question of all was not whether he survived. It was whether someone somewhere carried the truth quietly for decades, a family member, a friend. A coworker unaware that the polite man they once knew had once stood at the edge of an open aircraft door, wind roaring, rain freezing against his face. Preparing to vanish into one of the greatest mysteries in American history. By the time the FBI officially stepped back from active investigation in 2016, the D.B. Cooper case had transformed from a federal manhunt into something far more complex, a living mystery sustained by historians, journalists, amateur investigators, and ordinary people who simply could not let it go. What made the case so powerful was not just the crime itself, but the silence that followed. No dramatic arrest, no courtroom confession, no final chapter. Just a man who stepped into the night and erased himself from history. But as public interest continued, new suspects began rising into the spotlight, not through official channels, but through books, documentaries, and private research. One of the most widely discussed names in the modern era was Robert Rackstraw. Rackstraw was a former Army helicopter pilot and Vietnam War veteran with explosives training and parachute experience. He had used aliases before. He had a complicated past involving fraud and false identities. On paper, he appeared to match several aspects of the profile. Some independent investigators believed coded letters sent to newspapers after the hijacking pointed toward him. They argued that he possessed both the technical knowledge and the psychological profile necessary for the crime, but once again, there were gaps. Physical descriptions from flight attendants did not perfectly match Rackstraw. DNA comparisons were inconclusive. The FBI investigated him and ultimately stated there was insufficient evidence to link him to the hijacking. And so, like so many before him, his name faded back into the long list of possibilities. Then there was the persistent theory that Cooper may have been Canadian. The name Dan Cooper itself seemed unusual for an American hijacker in 1971. As investigators later learned, Dan Cooper was the name of a popular French-language comic book character in Canada, a daring Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who frequently parachuted into dangerous missions. The comic was not widely distributed in the United States at the time. This detail troubled investigators. How would an American in Portland, Oregon, know about a French-Canadian comic hero named Dan Cooper unless he had lived in Canada or spent time there? Or perhaps served in military units stationed near the border. It was a small clue, but in a case built on fragments, even small clues mattered. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained stubbornly limited. The tie still offered the most tangible link to the man himself. Further microscopic testing revealed additional rare particles, materials associated with specialized manufacturing processes in the late 1960s. Some researchers theorized that Cooper may have worked in facilities connected to Boeing's advanced projects, possibly even in classified aerospace programs during the Cold War. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s was a hub of innovation. Aerospace plants, defense contractors, and research labs operated throughout Washington state. Thousands of engineers and technicians worked quietly on projects involving experimental aircraft and advanced materials. Could Cooper have been one of them? A man comfortable around aircraft, frustrated by layoffs, perhaps financially strained during a period when Boeing faced economic downturns. It was possible. In 1971, Boeing had recently experienced massive layoffs. Nearly 60,000 workers lost their jobs as the aerospace industry struggled. Billboards in Seattle famously read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Economic tension filled the region. For some, resentment brewed quietly. If Cooper had once been part of that world, he may have felt overlooked, invisible, forgotten, but the psychology of the crime remained unusual. Unlike most hijackers of that era, Cooper did not demand political asylum. He did not issue a manifesto. He did not claim allegiance to any cause. He wanted money, and then he wanted to disappear. And disappear he did. Over the years, investigators studied the timeline repeatedly. They revisited witness statements from the crew. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow both described him as calm, polite, and intelligent. He did not smell of alcohol. He did not appear reckless. He seemed composed, almost detached. When he smiled, it was slight and controlled. He did not display fear. That detail lingered. Because if he had truly jumped into a freezing storm over pitch-black wilderness, he would have known the risk. So either he was extraordinarily confident in his abilities, or he was prepared to accept death, and that possibility added a deeper psychological layer. Some experts speculated that Cooper may not have expected to survive. Perhaps the jump itself was the final act, a carefully staged exit. A man who wanted to vanish so completely that even his body would not be found. But then the Columbia River money complicated that theory again. If he died instantly, how did 3 bundles of cash end up buried miles from the estimated landing zone? Why only 3 bundles? Why not the entire ransom? In the early 2000s, geologists examined the sand layers at Tina Bar more closely. They studied how sediment builds over time, how floods deposit material along riverbanks. Some suggested the money may have been buried years after the hijacking, possibly due to dredging activity that shifted sand from one area to another. Others argued that natural river dynamics alone could not fully explain the bundle's condition. There was even speculation, quiet, controversial speculation, that someone may have planted the money there later. A prank, a distraction, or perhaps someone who knew more than they admitted. But no proof ever supported that idea. The 3 bundles remained the only confirmed physical link between the hijacking and the outside world. Everything else was theory. And that is what makes the D.B. Cooper case so enduring. It exists in the space between probability and possibility. Each theory feels plausible for a moment until it falls apart under scrutiny. Each suspect seems convincing until a detail fails to align. And through it all, one image remains fixed in time. A Boeing 727 flying low through storm clouds, its rear staircase lowered into darkness. Wind screaming through the cabin as a lone figure stands at the edge, money strapped to his body, rain hitting his face. Did he hesitate? Did he look down at the endless forest below? Did he feel fear? Or was there only resolve? Somewhere in that black November sky at exactly 8:13 p.m. DB. Cooper stepped forward and became something more than a man. He became a question that would outlive generations. But as independent researchers continued digging through archives, flight logs, and military records, one emerging theory began gaining quiet attention. A theory that suggested the key to solving the case might not lie in the forest at all, but in a detail hidden in plain sight on the aircraft. Itself. For years, most people believed the mystery of D.B. Cooper would be solved in the forests of Washington. The search maps, the helicopters, the boots in the mud, everything pointed downward toward the ground, toward trees and rivers and remote wilderness. But as decades passed, some investigators began looking in a different direction. They began looking at the airplane itself. The Boeing 727 was not just the setting of the crime, it was a key part of the plan. And the more experts studied the aircraft, the more fascinating one feature became: the rear air stair. The Boeing 727 was one of the few commercial jets in the world designed with a built-in staircase at the rear of the fuselage. It allowed passengers to board from the back without airport equipment. It also meant that under certain conditions, the stairs could be lowered during flight. That design detail changed aviation history. After the Cooper hijacking, airlines rushed to modify their aircraft. A device called the Cooper vane was installed on 727s, a simple mechanical mechanism that prevented the rear stairs from being lowered while airborne. It was a direct result of what happened on November 24, 1971, but before that change, the stairs could be deployed midair. Still, there was debate. Could a person really jump safely from those stairs while the aircraft was flying at 10,000 feet and 170 knots? In the years after the hijacking, the FBI conducted experiments. Test jumps were performed from Boeing 727 aircraft under controlled conditions. Professional skydivers were asked to simulate the jump. The results were surprising. It was possible, not comfortable. Not easy, but possible. The airflow around the rear of the aircraft created a kind of pocket of relative stability. Unlike jumping from a side door into direct wind, exiting from the lowered rear stairs was more manageable than initially assumed. A jumper would be pulled downward, but not violently slammed against the tail as some early theories suggested. This discovery reshaped the conversation. Maybe Cooper wasn't reckless. Maybe he understood more than investigators first believed, but another question emerged. How did he know the stairs could be lowered in flight? This was not common knowledge among the general public in 1971. It wasn't printed in tourist brochures. It wasn't widely advertised in airline manuals available to passengers. It suggested familiarity, possibly technical familiarity. Some theorists proposed that Cooper may have been involved in testing or maintenance of aircraft. Others suggested he may have read technical manuals or had access to insider information. And then there was his calm instruction to the pilots about specific flap settings and altitude. He did not demand they fly at maximum height. He insisted on 10,000 feet, low enough to avoid the need for pressurization. He insisted on slower speed, making a jump survivable. He even requested the landing gear remain down, which would naturally limit speed and stabilize the aircraft further. These were not random demands from a desperate criminal. They were calculated. As more aviation experts weighed in over the years, some concluded that Cooper may not have been an expert skydiver, but he was almost certainly familiar with aviation systems. That distinction mattered. It suggested a different kind of background, perhaps not a career parachutist, but someone who worked around planes, someone who understood mechanical limits. And yet one detail continued to confuse even seasoned experts: the parachute he chose. When the 4 parachutes were delivered in Seattle, Cooper selected 2, one main chute and one reserve. Later analysis revealed that the reserve parachute he took was a training chute sewn shut, unusable in an emergency. Why would someone knowledgeable enough to plan such a detailed hijacking select faulty equipment? There are 2 major theories. The first is simple: he didn't know. If Cooper was not actually a skilled skydiver, he may not have recognized the difference between a functional reserve and a training model. In the low light of the cabin under pressure, perhaps he made a mistake, but the second theory is far more intriguing. Some believe he intentionally chose the faulty reserve because he never intended to use it. The real working parachute was enough. The reserve was just insurance in case authorities attempted to sabotage the gear. By asking for 4 parachutes and taking 2, he created the illusion that he might force someone else to jump with him. That would discourage tampering. If that theory is correct, then Cooper was thinking several steps ahead, but here is where things become even more complex. When investigators studied the type of main parachute he selected, they discovered it was an older military-style canopy, not a modern sport-style parachute. It required manual control. It was less stable, it was harder to maneuver. An experienced skydiver would likely have chosen the more advanced option, so why didn't he? Some experts argue that the older chute may have appeared sturdier to an untrained eye. Others suggest he may have been familiar with military-style equipment from earlier decades. Again, 2 possibilities, and no certainty. As aviation specialists continued reviewing the case in the 2000s, some began questioning the estimated jump location altogether. They reanalyzed cockpit recordings and flight data. They examined the exact moment when the pressure bump was felt in the cabin, believed to be the moment Cooper jumped. If that timing was off by even a minute, the landing zone could shift dramatically. Instead of dense forest near aerial, he might have landed closer to open farmland or nearer to roads. or even near small communities where he could blend in quickly. This possibility reopened the survival theory. What if he didn't land deep in wilderness? What if he landed somewhere manageable? Perhaps injured, perhaps shaken, but alive. And if he survived, what did he do next? Did he have an accomplice waiting? The FBI found no evidence of a partner. No suspicious vehicles reported in the area. No witnesses who saw a man stumbling out of the woods with a bag of cash. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If he planned the hijacking carefully, he may have planned the escape just as carefully. Another detail often overlooked is the timing. The night before Thanksgiving, a time when roads were busy. When families were traveling, when attention was divided. In the confusion of holiday traffic, a soaked man appearing on a roadside might not draw as much suspicion as one would assume. And then there is the weather. It was raining heavily that night. Wind gusts were strong, cloud cover was thick, visibility was low, bad conditions for a jump. But also perfect conditions for disappearing. No clear witnesses, no clear footprints, rain washing away evidence. Every element of the environment seemed to work in Cooper's favor or against him, depending on which theory one believes, and that is what keeps the case alive. Every detail supports two different stories at once. He was skilled, he was reckless, he survived, he died, he was an insider, he was an outsider. The airplane experiments proved one thing clearly: the jump could be done. The question remained whether it was done successfully. And as researchers began shifting attention from forests to flight mechanics, from rivers to engineering details, a subtle realization began forming. Maybe the key to solving the Cooper mystery was not buried in Washington soil at all. Maybe it was hidden in the kind of man who would choose that exact plane on that exact day and step into darkness without ever looking back. Because understanding the aircraft was only half the puzzle. Understanding the man, that was the real mystery. The search for D.B. Cooper did not end when the headlines faded. In many ways, it was only beginning. Behind closed doors, inside the quiet offices of the FBI's Portland field office, agents continued to build what they hoped would become the key to solving the mystery. The case file grew thicker by the week, reports from witnesses, forensic results, theories scribbled in the margins, maps covered in circles and red lines. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. Because somewhere inside that stack of paper was the truth. The composite sketch of the hijacker was refined again and again. Witnesses described him as calm, polite, well-spoken. He did not appear nervous. He did not shout or threaten. He smoked cigarettes slowly and drank bourbon and soda. He paid for his ticket in cash. He wore a dark business suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and a raincoat. On his lapel, a small pearl tie pin. His hair was dark brown or black, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, perhaps early 50s. Not a young radical, not a desperate teenager, but a mature man who understood what he was doing. Agents studied that description carefully. They compared it to thousands of men across the country: veterans, paratroopers, engineers, pilots, mechanics. Anyone with knowledge of aircraft and parachutes. The hijacker had demonstrated specific understanding of the Boeing 727. He knew about the rear air stair, a feature not widely known to the public at the time. He knew the plane could fly at low altitude and slow speed. He knew how to request parachutes in a way that prevented the crew from sabotaging him. These were not random choices. They suggested training, experience, planning. The FBI gave the investigation a code name, NORJAK, Northwest Hijacking. It sounded almost clinical, but behind that word was a massive operation. More than 800 suspects were considered over the years. Hundreds were interviewed. Many were eliminated quickly. Others lingered on the list, their names resurfacing whenever new evidence appeared. Some were reported by family members, angry wives, suspicious coworkers, old friends who remembered strange behavior around Thanksgiving 1971. Each tip had to be examined. In the weeks after the hijacking, agents focused on the ransom money. The $20 bills had recorded serial numbers. If Cooper tried to spend the cash, it might be traced. Banks were alerted. Casinos were warned. Law enforcement agencies across the country were notified. For months, agents watched and waited, but nothing happened. No marked bills surfaced. No suspicious deposits. It was as if the money had vanished into thin air. The parachutes also became a central piece of the investigation. The FBI traced their origins. The two main parachutes had come from a local skydiving school. The reserve chutes had been obtained from a private skydiving enthusiast. One of those reserves turned out to be a dummy training parachute, sewn shut and not functional for actual jumping. Cooper had chosen the working parachute and left the dummy behind. That detail puzzled investigators. If he was inexperienced, he might not have noticed the difference. But he did. That suggested knowledge. Still, questions remained. The parachute Cooper used was not the most advanced available. It was older, manual, not equipped with steering capabilities like some sport chutes of the time. If he truly was an expert, why choose that one? Some agents argued that perhaps he did not have the deep skydiving experience they first assumed. Maybe he knew just enough to sound convincing. Just enough to make the crew cooperate. The debate continued in meeting rooms late into the night. As winter deepened in the Pacific Northwest, search efforts slowed. Snow covered the forests. Rivers swelled with rain. The terrain in southwest Washington was unforgiving. Thick woods, steep hills, wide rivers. If Cooper had landed there, survival would not have been easy. Nighttime temperatures dropped sharply in late November. He had jumped wearing a business suit and loafers. No heavy coat, no boots, no survival gear. Some investigators believed the cold alone could have killed him. Others were not so sure. The man had planned carefully. Perhaps he had prepared for that too. In early 1972, the FBI conducted an extensive ground search in the suspected drop zone. Agents, soldiers, and volunteers combed the forest. They looked for fabric scraps, parachute cords, remains. Anything that could connect to the hijacker. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs sniffed the ground. The effort was massive, and it found nothing. No body, no parachute, no money. That silence was unsettling. It allowed the legend to grow. Across the country, the story of D.B. Cooper took on a strange life of its own. Newspapers printed theories. Television hosts speculated. Some people admired his boldness. Others condemned his crime. He became a symbol of something rebellious, something mysterious. A man who challenged the system and disappeared into the night. The fact that no one was hurt made the story feel almost unreal, like a movie script. But inside the FBI, there was no romance, only frustration. Agents re-examined the flight path. They calculated wind speeds, drift patterns, and jump conditions. They reconstructed the possible landing areas again and again. They even tested jumps from a Boeing 727 under similar conditions to understand what Cooper might have experienced. Those test jumps were difficult. The blast of cold air, the darkness. The instability of the aircraft at that angle. It was not an easy exit. It required courage or desperation. One key detail haunted investigators, the clip-on tie left behind on Cooper's seat. It was a simple black tie, common and unremarkable, but it became one of the only physical items directly connected to him. The FBI preserved it carefully. At the time, forensic science was limited. Fingerprint analysis yielded little. The tie had been handled by many people. Still, agents kept it, hoping that one day technology might reveal something more. Years passed. The case did not close. It simply aged. New suspects emerged. Some were serious. Others were wild guesses. A few men even claimed to be Cooper, though none could prove it. Journalists wrote books. Amateur investigators developed theories. Was he a military veteran with parachute training, a former airline employee, a disgruntled engineer? The possibilities seemed endless. And then, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, something unexpected happened. In February 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River near a place called Tina Bar. He was on vacation with his family. As he scraped away at the sand, he uncovered something unusual. 3 bundles of $20 bills, tightly packed and rubber-banded together. When authorities examined the bills, they made a shocking discovery. The serial numbers matched the ransom money from the Cooper hijacking. For the first time in almost a decade, there was a physical link to the crime. The money had surfaced, but instead of solving the mystery, it deepened it. How had the cash ended up buried along the riverbank, miles from the assumed drop zone? Had Cooper survived and lost some of the money? Had the river carried it there over time? Or had someone placed it there deliberately? The discovery reignited the investigation. Agents returned to maps, to theories, to calculations about water flow and erosion. The mystery was no longer just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about how pieces of his story had drifted through time, waiting to be found. And as investigators began to re-examine everything they thought they knew, a new chapter in the D.B. Cooper case was about to unfold. the discovery of the money at Tina Bar in 1980 changed everything. For nearly 9 years, the case of D.B. Cooper had felt frozen in time. A plane, a jump, a disappearance, nothing more. But now 3 bundles of $20 bills, almost $5,800 in total, had emerged from the sand along the Columbia River. The serial numbers matched the ransom money exactly. It was undeniable. For the FBI, this was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The location of the money did not fit neatly into earlier theories. Tina Bar was not in the primary projected drop zone. It sat along a wide stretch of the Columbia River, far south of where investigators had once concentrated their ground searches. If Cooper had landed in the rugged forests of southwest Washington, how did some of the ransom money travel miles downstream and end up buried in sand? Agents immediately reopened detailed analysis of river currents. They studied sediment patterns, seasonal flooding, and dredging operations from the 1970s. They tried to determine whether the Columbia River could have carried the money from a landing site near the Lewis River all the way to Tina Bar. Some experts believed it was possible. Others were skeptical. The condition of the bills raised more questions. They were decayed but still bundled together with rubber bands. The bands themselves had deteriorated, but the bills remained stacked in neat packets. That detail was strange. If the money had floated freely in the river for years, it likely would have scattered. Yet here it was, grouped and partially buried, as if placed there. Some theorized that Cooper may have survived the jump, but lost part of the ransom during his descent. Perhaps the money bag tore open in midair. Maybe some bundles fell into the river while he landed elsewhere. Another theory suggested that Cooper himself could have buried a portion of the cash for safekeeping, only for it to be uncovered years later by erosion. But if that were true, why only 3 bundles? And why there, the boy who found the money had been digging a shallow hole for a campfire? The bundles were just beneath the surface. That meant they had not been buried deeply. Over time, the riverbank had shifted. Sandbars formed and disappeared with changing currents. The Columbia was powerful and unpredictable. It reshaped its shores constantly. FBI divers searched the area again. They combed the riverbed. They expanded the perimeter, but no additional money was found. It was as if the river had chosen to reveal only a small fragment of the truth. The discovery reignited public fascination. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Television crews visited Tina Bar, filming the quiet shoreline where the cash had surfaced. The mystery felt alive again. People wondered, if the money was here, was Cooper dead somewhere upstream? Or was he alive, watching from a distance as his legend grew? Inside the FBI, agents revisited old suspects. By 1980, the case file had grown enormous. More than 800 individuals had been investigated at some point. Many were eliminated through alibis, fingerprints, or simple inconsistencies, but a handful remained intriguing. One suspect was a former Army paratrooper with explosives training. He had a criminal record and a history of bold behavior. Another was an airline employee who had deep knowledge of the Boeing 727. Yet another was a quiet engineer who disappeared from his job shortly after Thanksgiving 1971. Each suspect had pieces that seemed to fit and pieces that did not. The problem was always the same. No direct evidence. Fingerprints lifted from the aircraft in 1971 had been inconclusive. The tie left behind offered little at the time. The parachutes had vanished. The ransom money, aside from the small portion at Tina Bar, had never reappeared in circulation. No marked bills turned up in banks or casinos. It was almost as if Cooper had stepped outside the system entirely. As years passed, the world changed. Airport security tightened. The rear air stairs of Boeing 727 aircraft were modified to prevent similar hijackings. The device that stopped such jumps became known as the Cooper vane. It physically prevented the staircase from being lowered during flight. In a strange way, Cooper had permanently altered aviation security, but the man himself remained invisible. The FBI continued to test theories about the jump. They recreated the flight conditions using similar aircraft. They examined wind speeds and drop trajectories. Some calculations suggested that Cooper likely landed southeast of Ariel, Washington, in heavily wooded terrain. Other models shifted the zone slightly, depending on assumptions about when he jumped. One haunting possibility lingered in quiet conversations among investigators. What if Cooper never intended to survive? What if the jump was a calculated risk he knew he might not overcome? The night was dark, the weather was cold and rainy. The terrain below was unforgiving. If he had misjudged even slightly, he could have struck trees at high speed or landed in deep water. And yet no remains were ever found, no parachute canopy tangled in branches, no skeletal remains discovered by hikers, no metal hardware uncovered during logging operations. Over decades, that area of Washington saw significant activity: timber cutting, road construction, hunters, campers, still nothing. The absence of evidence became evidence itself. In the 1990s, advances in forensic science gave the case new life. DNA technology was improving. The FBI revisited the tie. Tiny particles were found on the fabric, microscopic traces that might hint at Cooper's occupation. Investigators identified rare metal particles, including titanium and other specialty alloys. Some believed this suggested he worked in aerospace or a high-tech industry, but even that clue was not definitive. Titanium was used in many industries during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Aerospace, yes, but also manufacturing and chemical processing. It narrowed the field only slightly. Meanwhile, amateur investigators and journalists continued to dig. Books were published, documentaries filmed. Each new suspect generated excitement. Some families came forward with dramatic claims. They pointed to deathbed confessions, to suspicious bank accounts, to men who had once owned parachutes or flown planes. But every time the FBI required proof, solid scientific proof, and it never came. The small cache of money from Tina Bar remained the only confirmed physical trace of the hijacking outside the aircraft itself. It sat in evidence lockers, carefully preserved. A reminder that the crime had been real, that $200,000 in cash had once passed from trembling hands to a calm man in a suit. As the decades stretched on, the Cooper case transformed from an active investigation into something else, a cultural legend wrapped around a very real crime. It became a puzzle that refused to be solved, a question mark hanging over American criminal history. Yet for the agents who had worked it, it was never just a story. It was unfinished business. And as new forensic techniques continued to develop and new suspects quietly emerged from the shadows, the possibility remained that one day, the mystery of D.B. Cooper might finally crack open. But first, investigators would have to confront the most compelling suspects of all, the men whose lives seemed to echo too closely with the events of November 24, 1971. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the D.B. Cooper case had become more than a criminal investigation. It was a phenomenon, a story that haunted both law enforcement and the public imagination. The FBI's Portland office had long since been flooded with letters, tips, and confessions, some genuine, some clearly fabricated, others bordering on the fantastical. Yet within that noise, the investigators sought patterns, small consistencies that could point them toward the man behind the legend. They returned to the few concrete clues left from that night: the tie, the partial description, the ransom money, the aircraft's flight details. Each clue offered fragments of insight, pieces of a puzzle that remained maddeningly incomplete. Cooper's careful, composed manner during the hijacking became a central theme in profiling him. He was courteous, precise, and seemingly methodical. He demanded exactly what he needed: money, parachutes, instructions for the flight, but he gave nothing unnecessary. There was no unnecessary violence, no random threats beyond those required to control the situation. In an era when hijackings often involved terror and chaos, Cooper stood out. He was a meticulous operator, a man who understood not only the mechanics of his crime, but the psychology of his victims and the system he sought to manipulate. Investigators began revisiting the psychological profiles more intensely, piecing together the type of person who could commit such an audacious act. He was likely intelligent, observant, and technically skilled. He had to have a working knowledge of aircraft and parachutes, as well as a calm demeanor under extreme stress. The fact that he did not drink excessively or smoke in a reckless manner during the flight suggested discipline. He had studied his environment and calculated risks, from the selection of the aircraft to the time of day, to the weather and landing conditions. These traits led profilers to consider a very specific type of individual, a man who may have been trained in structured, high-pressure environments, possibly military, aviation, or engineering sectors. His ability to maintain composure indicated confidence in his own plan, perhaps developed over years of experience. The puzzle was that he could vanish entirely, suggesting not just planning but a capacity for extreme patience and long-term thinking. Qualities that were not often associated with criminal behavior at such a young age. The FBI also revisited the peculiarities of his choices during the hijacking. Cooper's request that the rear air stair remain down, his insistence on specific altitude and speed, and his careful handling of the parachutes all suggested operational knowledge. Yet his selection of the manual, military-style parachute over a potentially easier modern canopy seemed contradictory. Perhaps he understood its mechanics and felt more comfortable with something familiar to him. Perhaps he was deliberately choosing equipment that limited unpredictability. Even his removal of the black clip-on tie before jumping was an intentional act. It could have been a practical choice, reducing drag during the jump, or it could have been symbolic, a shedding of identity before disappearing. That tie left behind on seat 18C became one of the few physical connections to the man himself. As decades passed, investigators examined it under advanced microscopes and found traces of metal dust, possibly titanium or alloys associated with industrial or aerospace environments, hinting again at his occupational background. While the FBI pursued leads, outside researchers began developing elaborate theories regarding Cooper's fate. Some proposed that he died during the jump, claiming that the treacherous conditions of the Pacific Northwest's November night, coupled with the risk of hypothermia and rough terrain, made survival unlikely. Yet the discovery of the money at Tina Bar complicated that theory. The 3 bundles of bills, partially buried in sand, suggested that someone had at least moved some of the ransom later, whether intentionally or through natural forces. This anomaly left room for speculation. Had Cooper survived and hidden some of the cash for future retrieval, or had the river's currents carried it downstream after an accidental fall? The condition of the bills, neatly stacked, rubber-banded, and preserved despite years of exposure to the elements, added a surreal twist. How could natural processes deposit and maintain them in that manner? If Cooper had perished, why was there no trace of his parachute, clothing, or remains, even after thousands of searches through forests, riverbanks, and rugged terrain? Amateur investigators and journalists fueled the myth further. Books were published dissecting every minute detail, recreating the flight and the jump, theorizing about Cooper's potential identity and motives. Some posited that he was a former paratrooper with experience in high-altitude jumps, while others suggested he was a disgruntled engineer or aerospace technician familiar with the Boeing 727. Each theory had small supporting evidence and glaring contradictions. Some suspects seemed to fit the profile physically, psychologically, or professionally, but none could be conclusively linked to the crime. Others emerged from the shadows decades later, claiming knowledge or confessing, but the FBI had learned to treat these carefully. Many were hoaxes, attention-seeking attempts, or imaginative retellings. Despite decades of investigation, the FBI's files showed an obsessive attention to detail. Analysts revisited old flight records, cross-referenced thousands of tips, and conducted hundreds of interviews. Technological advances, from aerial mapping to forensic analysis, were applied to the case even as early as the 1980s and 1990s. The tie, the parachutes, the plane, the money, all were re-examined with modern tools. Experts debated the dynamics of the jump, the potential survival rates, and the realistic landing zones. They studied topography, meteorology, and wind currents, attempting to reconstruct that November night with greater accuracy than the original investigators could. Each calculation seemed to open new possibilities, but also new contradictions. The more precise the models became, the wider the potential area of survival appeared. And throughout all of this, Cooper's psychology remained a focus. Behavioral analysts speculated about his motives. Unlike most hijackers, Cooper's crime lacked political or ideological goals. It was financial, calculated, and self-contained. He did not harm the crew or passengers unnecessarily. He did not leave messages or threats. He exhibited an almost clinical understanding of human behavior and authority, manipulating the situation with minimal risk to himself or others until the final leap into darkness. This duality, criminal yet methodical, bold yet disciplined, added layers to the legend. Cooper was not just a man who vanished. He was a man who transformed an ordinary act into a carefully choreographed sequence, leaving behind a case that challenged law enforcement, captivated the public, and transcended the era in which it occurred. Even decades later, his story continued to resonate. People speculated on his identity not only because of the crime, but because of what it represented: audacity, intelligence, and the ultimate vanishing act. Cooper was more than a criminal. He was a ghost in the system, a figure who exposed vulnerabilities in aviation security, challenged law enforcement methods, and created a narrative that would endure long past the actual event. And yet, despite the public fascination and exhaustive investigation, the mystery persisted. Every clue, every theory, every new lead seemed to generate more questions than answers, leaving the case in a perpetual state of suspense, as if Cooper himself had designed it that way. The story of D.B. Cooper at this point had become a puzzle in multiple dimensions: geography, psychology, aviation mechanics, and human behavior. Each element demanded scrutiny, yet none offered finality. The man who boarded Flight 305, who requested ransom, who calmly walked the aisle, and who vanished into a stormy November night, remained elusive. And as new generations of investigators, journalists, and enthusiasts examined the decades-old evidence, they were confronted with the same stark reality faced by the original team in 1971, D.B. Cooper was not just a man, he was a mystery, engineered to withstand the passage of time. And in the quiet moments when investigators revisited the flight logs or the sparse witness accounts, one question lingered like the cold November wind over the Columbia River: did D.B. Cooper truly survive the jump, or had he vanished in a carefully calculated final act, leaving behind only fragments of a story that would outlive him and continue to haunt the imagination of everyone who dared to chase it? The decades following the hijacking saw the legend of D.B. Cooper grow into something almost mythic, a story whispered across generations of law enforcement, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. Yet for the FBI, there was no romance in the tale, only an unyielding, unresolved investigation that demanded answers. By the 1990s, technological advancements began to reshape what was possible in criminal forensics. Agents revisited old evidence with new eyes, applying methods unavailable during the early days of the case. The tie left on seat 18C was examined under electron microscopes, revealing traces of metal particles, possibly titanium. That suggested Cooper had worked in a specialized industrial or aerospace field. Such findings, though circumstantial, were tantalizing. They hinted at a life outside the ordinary, a man whose skills extended beyond average civilian knowledge, whose hands had touched machinery or materials few others handled. The parachutes, too, were reconsidered. While most had vanished or were returned to suppliers, investigators reconstructed their specifications, testing the jump dynamics under controlled conditions using modern equipment. Simulations demonstrated that, while treacherous, the jump was physically survivable, even in the darkness and rain that night. This understanding, however, deepened the mystery. If the jump was possible, and Cooper understood the mechanics of both the plane and the parachute, why was there no trace of him? No footprints, no remains, no verified sightings. It was as though he had stepped out of reality and into legend, leaving investigators to chase shadows in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. The profile of the man also evolved. Behavioral analysts pored over the events of that night, considering every word spoken, every gesture, and every decision Cooper made. He was calm, methodical, and deliberately polite, never threatening beyond the necessary commands. He smoked calmly, sipped bourbon, and handled the crew with what could only be described as detached precision. This was not the behavior of a desperate criminal, nor was it the conduct of someone entirely unskilled. Instead, Cooper's actions suggested strategic thinking, practiced discipline, and perhaps a background where high-stress situations were normal. Analysts speculated that he could have been a military paratrooper, a former pilot, or a professional familiar with aircraft mechanics. The way he manipulated the crew, choosing their cooperation over intimidation, indicated psychological insight. He understood authority, human reactions, and the way to manage risk, not just his own, but that of the passengers and crew. Every detail of his plan, from the timing to the parachute selection to the exact flight parameters, suggested meticulous preparation. And yet, for all this planning, one detail remained confounding. The reserve parachute he chose was a dummy, sewn shut and unusable. Whether this was a mistake or intentional, it became a focal point for speculation, highlighting Cooper's balance between knowledge, risk, and perhaps a desire to manipulate perception. The Tina Bar discovery in 1980 further complicated the narrative. The bundles of $20 bills, partially buried along the Columbia River, were the first tangible connection to Cooper outside of the plane. The bills were neatly bundled, though partially degraded by exposure to the elements over nearly a decade. This raised more questions than it answered. If Cooper survived, why were only 3 bundles found? Had he lost them in the jump, or had he buried them for retrieval? If he did not survive, how did the river deposit the money there? The physics of river currents, sand deposition, and erosion offered theories, but no definitive answers. Every path the money might have taken seemed plausible yet incomplete, adding layers of uncertainty. To this day, Tina Bar remains one of the only confirmed physical remnants of the hijacking discovered outside the aircraft. It was both a clue and a riddle, an artifact that fueled speculation and kept the case alive in the public imagination. Over the years, dozens of suspects were considered, often decades after the crime itself. Some were ex-military men with aviation experience. Others were airline employees, engineers, or ordinary men with unusual knowledge or behavior. Each candidate was carefully investigated, backgrounds checked, alibis verified, and behavior scrutinized for anything that matched Cooper's known characteristics. One man, a former paratrooper, had been unemployed at the time and familiar with the Boeing 727 specifications. Another, a quiet aerospace technician, had a deep knowledge of materials and mechanical systems, including parachutes. Every lead required exhaustive vetting, and yet none could be confirmed. DNA and fingerprint technology, while advancing, had yielded nothing conclusive. The tie, the plane, and the money remained the only surviving physical evidence, each tantalizingly linked to Cooper, but incapable of identifying him definitively. Public fascination also evolved during these decades. The case became more than a law enforcement puzzle, it became folklore. Movies, documentaries, books, and television specials recounted the audacious crime with every dramatic detail. Cooper became an archetype, the man who had outsmarted authorities, vanished without a trace, and taunted generations of investigators. People speculated not only about his identity, but about his fate. Did he survive the jump into the stormy November night? Did he live out his days quietly, perhaps under a new name? Or had he perished in the wilderness, leaving the money at Tina Bar as the only evidence of his existence? Even amateur investigators used modern tools to recreate his jump, model the flight dynamics, and estimate landing zones, often producing conflicting conclusions. By the mid-1990s, the FBI officially narrowed its investigation to a handful of high-priority suspects, focusing resources on individuals whose backgrounds, skills, and behaviors most closely matched the profile. This concentrated effort revealed patterns and inconsistencies that had been overlooked in earlier decades. Surveillance of financial records, property ownership, and travel histories became more sophisticated. Analysts also studied the socio-cultural context of the 1970s, examining how Cooper's life might have intersected with aviation trends, military service, and regional geography. All of these threads were woven into a complex narrative, a tapestry that connected psychology, mechanics, geography, and human behavior into a single, unresolved story. And yet, after more than 20 years, the case remained unsolved. Cooper was a ghost, a man whose audacity had created an enigma far larger than the crime itself. Every flight simulation, every psychological profile, every theoretical landing zone provided tantalizing possibilities but no answers. The legend of DB. Cooper had evolved beyond a mere hijacking. It was a story about preparation, intelligence, and disappearance, a puzzle that tested the limits of investigative persistence. The mystery persisted because Cooper's actions were perfectly engineered to leave ambiguity. He had left evidence just enough to prove the crime, but not enough to lead to his capture. His calm demeanor, technical knowledge, and strategic foresight created a scenario, that defied conventional detection methods. By understanding the plane, the parachutes, the crew, and the environment, he transformed a violent act into a carefully choreographed vanishing act. And with each passing decade, that vanishing act became more than a crime. It became a legend that would continue to captivate minds, inspire theories, and challenge investigators. Leaving a haunting question at the heart of the story, was D.B. Cooper still alive, watching from the shadows, or had he vanished forever into the night? As the 21st century dawned, the legend of D.B. Cooper had grown into a cultural phenomenon, yet for the FBI, it remained one of the most tantalizing unsolved cases in American history. By now, investigators had pored over thousands of documents, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and re-examined every shred of physical evidence available. The tie, the parachutes, and the money from Tina Barr had been subjected to decades of scientific scrutiny, yet none could definitively reveal the man's identity. The Tina Barr discovery, in particular, continued to spark debate. Some analysts argued that the partial ransom money indicated survival. The neatly bundled bills implied careful handling rather than random scattering by the river. Yet the absence of additional cash or personal items suggested that if Cooper had lived, he left nothing behind to betray his presence. It was almost as if he had meticulously erased every trace of his existence, leaving only a fragment of his plan as a whisper of evidence for the authorities to chase. For the FBI, the focus shifted toward reconstructing every aspect of that fateful night with greater precision than ever before. Flight simulations were performed using modern Boeing 727 replicas, considering every variable from altitude to airspeed, temperature to wind patterns. Each simulation added depth to the understanding of the jump, yet each also highlighted the extreme difficulty of surviving such a leap. Cooper had exited into darkness, rain, and cold, wearing only a business suit and dress shoes with minimal protective gear. Even with parachute knowledge, the challenges were formidable. Turbulence near the rear air stair, the risk of entanglement with trees, uneven landing terrain, and the bitter November cold. Some simulations concluded survival was plausible but incredibly risky. Others suggested that death was probable. This uncertainty added layers to the mystery, making it difficult to reach a definitive conclusion about Cooper's fate. Meanwhile, the psychological profile of Cooper continued to be a central element of investigation. Behavioral analysts studied every interaction he had with the crew. His calm, polite manner was not simply an affectation. It was a tool, a method to exert control without inciting panic. He smoked slowly, sipped his bourbon with care, and handled the crew's compliance with subtle authority. It was almost surgical in precision, reflecting someone who had likely trained under conditions where measured behavior was essential for survival. Analysts speculated that his selection of the dummy reserve parachute alongside the functional main chute might have been an intentional psychological safeguard. By choosing the working chute and leaving the dummy, he minimized risk while controlling perception, a subtle demonstration of strategic thinking that extended beyond the mechanics of the hijacking itself. As the investigation progressed into the 2000s, the FBI expanded their focus on potential suspects. The list had long been narrowed, but investigators continued to scrutinize men whose backgrounds, skills, and behaviors aligned with the known profile. These included former military paratroopers, ex-airline personnel, and engineers with knowledge of aircraft and parachute mechanics. Each candidate underwent intense review, including interviews with family, friends, and colleagues. Financial records were examined for suspicious activity, travel histories were reconstructed, and forensic evidence was cross-referenced. Even decades after the hijacking, the meticulous nature of Cooper's planning made the identification of a single suspect extraordinarily challenging. Many leads once promising were eliminated by alibis or inconsistencies, leaving only fragments of possibility. The cultural fascination with Cooper only intensified over time. Books, documentaries, and podcasts examine the case from every angle, often speculating wildly about his motives and fate. Some portrayed him as a rogue anti-hero, a man who outwitted authority and disappeared into legend. Others focused on the sheer audacity of the crime, emphasizing the logistical mastery required to hijack a plane, demand a ransom, and vanish without a trace. Amateur sleuths continued to analyze flight data, wind currents, and topography, constructing elaborate models of potential landing zones. Each theory, while imaginative, added to the mythos. A man who was more than a criminal, more than a suspect, he had become a symbol of audacious disappearance and the ultimate vanishing act. Inside law enforcement circles, debates persisted over Cooper's fate. Some agents believed he had perished during the jump, a victim of the dark night, rain, and harsh terrain. The partial ransom money at Tina Bar could have been scattered in the river or buried unintentionally by floodwaters. Others argued for survival, noting his precision and calculated risk-taking during the hijacking. Survival would have required not only parachute knowledge, but careful preparation for landing and escape. Yet if he survived, how had he remained completely undetected for decades? No sightings, no bank transactions traced back to marked bills, no inadvertent contact with acquaintances had surfaced. Cooper's disappearance seemed almost supernatural in its perfection, a vanishing act that defied conventional understanding. In 2016, after 45 years, the FBI officially closed its active investigation into the case. They cited diminishing returns, aging evidence, and the death of many original investigators. Yet the legend of Cooper did not end. Public interest remained intense, fueled by new books, online discussions, and historical retrospectives. Scholars and enthusiasts continued to speculate, reanalyze, and debate every detail, from the flight path and weather conditions to the psychological profile and potential identities. Cooper's story had transcended the realm of crime. It had become a modern folklore, a narrative shaped as much by imagination as by fact. And yet, for all the speculation, the unanswered questions remained. The precise mechanics of the jump, the survival or death of Cooper, and the mysterious reappearance of partial ransom money all contributed to an enduring enigma. Every attempt to solve the puzzle revealed new complexities, often highlighting the brilliance of the man behind it. Cooper had engineered not just a crime, but a lasting mystery, one that challenged investigators, captivated the public, and inspired fascination across generations. As the story of D.B. Cooper continued to unfold in public consciousness, one truth remained undeniable. The hijacker of Flight 305 had created a legend so complete that it could not be contained by facts alone. Every clue, every witness, every shred of evidence served as a thread in a larger tapestry of mystery. One that promised to captivate minds and fuel debates long after the night, he vanished into the stormy sky over the Pacific Northwest. And as we consider the man who could plan, execute, and disappear with such precision, we are left with a single haunting question: who was D.B. Cooper, and did he ever truly leave the shadows he so carefully manipulated? Even decades after the hijacking, the image of D.B. Cooper persisted vividly in the minds of investigators, journalists, and the public alike. He was no longer merely a criminal. He had become a symbol of audacity, intelligence, and calculated risk, a man who had challenged authority and disappeared so completely that he had become, in essence, immortalized by mystery. In those quiet offices of the FBI, where files stacked to the ceiling documented every tip, lead, and suspect, the agents often reflected on the audacity of his plan. He had chosen a Boeing 727 with a rear air stare, knowing precisely how it operated. He had requested the exact flight parameters, the altitude, and the speed that would optimize his jump while minimizing immediate danger. He had managed to maintain composure, keep the passengers calm, and even earn a measure of reluctant respect from the crew. In doing so, he had demonstrated a combination of technical knowledge, psychological acuity, and precise timing that few could match. The hijacking itself was executed like a careful performance, each movement choreographed, each command measured. Yet it was what came after the jump that continued to captivate minds. The notion that he could vanish into the dark, rainy night over the forests and rivers of the Pacific Northwest and leave behind almost no trace was almost beyond belief. Investigators had spent years analyzing the terrain, studying aerial maps, calculating wind patterns, and recreating the jump with test dummies and simulations. Some models suggested he could have survived the jump if he landed in dense forested areas and moved carefully, evading roads and settlements. Others emphasized the peril: hypothermia in November, jagged terrain, rivers swollen with rain, and the risk of injury from trees or landing errors. The more the simulations were refined, the more it became clear that survival was possible but precarious, requiring a combination of skill, preparation, and perhaps a measure of luck that only Cooper seemed to possess. The mystery of the Tina Bar money only deepened the intrigue. The partial ransom that had washed ashore nearly a decade after the hijacking raised innumerable questions. Why were only 3 bundles discovered? How had they remained so neatly stacked despite years of exposure to the elements? Could Cooper have buried them intentionally, planning to retrieve them later, or had they been swept downstream by the river, yet remained mysteriously undisturbed? Even the most seasoned forensic analysts struggled to reconcile the location and condition of the money with the known facts of the hijacking. The discovery seemed almost like a breadcrumb left for the investigators, tantalizing but incomplete, suggesting survival yet providing no concrete answers. It was a clue that simultaneously promised revelation and perpetuated the mystery. In the ensuing decades, amateur sleuths, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts approached the case with both reverence and obsessive curiosity. Online forums buzzed with debates over Cooper's identity, potential suspects, and theories about his fate. Some proposed he had died shortly after the jump, leaving the remainder of the ransom along the river. Others imagined he had assumed a new identity, blending into society while quietly enjoying the fortune he had stolen. Each theory built upon fragments of evidence, small inconsistencies, or circumstantial observations. Some considered family histories, occupational connections, and the odd disappearance of certain individuals during that period. Every lid was dissected, yet each ultimately ended with the same frustrating void. No verifiable proof of his identity, location, or survival had ever been found. The cultural impact of the case was profound, DB. Cooper's daring hijacking influenced aviation security, giving rise to the Cooper vane, a device installed on Boeing 727s to prevent the rear air stair from being lowered in flight. The act was no longer just a crime. It became a catalyst for systemic change, a reminder of vulnerabilities in seemingly secure systems. Yet the man himself remained a ghost, a figure who had achieved what few could. He had orchestrated a crime with precision, evaded capture, and vanished without leaving a definitive trail. He had exploited weaknesses in technology, human psychology, and circumstance, creating a scenario that law enforcement struggled to resolve even decades later. As modern investigative techniques evolved, the FBI periodically revisited the case, applying DNA analysis, advanced forensics, and computer modeling to the existing evidence. Yet even with these tools, Cooper's identity remained elusive. The tie, the parachutes, and the river-bound money continued to offer tantalizing hints but no conclusive answers. The man who had carried out such an audacious plan was no longer merely a suspect. He had become a master of disappearing into plain sight, leaving the world to ponder the possibilities of his life and fate. In popular culture, D.B. Cooper became an enduring figure. He appeared in films, novels, television shows, and countless articles, a symbol of ingenuity and daring mystery. Yet beyond the legend, the real story lingered in the meticulous notes, flight records, and witness accounts preserved in the FBI's archives. Each detail, from his polite commands to the careful handling of the ransom money, revealed glimpses of a man who was extraordinarily methodical, observant, and disciplined. He had understood risk, timing, and human behavior, and had executed a plan that defied conventional criminal expectations. Even today, investigators and enthusiasts alike consider the same haunting questions. Did Cooper survive the jump and live out his life in obscurity, or did he perish, leaving only fragments of his plan as evidence? How did the Columbia River carry the partial ransom, and why had no additional money ever been recovered? Could modern technology ever unlock the secret, or was the genius of Cooper's plan in the fact that it had left nothing definitive to trace? These questions ensure that the story continues, a mystery both historical and psychological, scientific and cultural. And as the shadows of the Pacific Northwest forests stretch over rivers and hills on a cold November night, one cannot help but imagine the figure of D.B. Cooper, the man who stepped off an air stair into darkness, vanished into legend, and forever challenged the limits of human ingenuity and law enforcement. His story is not just one of crime. It is a story of intellect, precision, and the audacity to defy capture entire life. And as long as the forests, the rivers, and the night remain, so too will the haunting question that endures. Who was D.B. Cooper, and where did he disappear to? The story of D.B. Cooper, as it entered the final decades of the 20th century and moved into the new millennium, became as much about the man as it was about the myth. For the FBI, the case had transformed into a decades-long exercise in patience, persistence, and the limits of investigative science. Files grew heavier, evidence lockers more crowded, and leads trickled in with diminishing frequency, yet each piece was treated with the utmost care. Even the smallest detail, a passenger's memory of Cooper's calm demeanor, the subtle folding of the ransom money, or the trace of titanium on his tie, was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and analyzed, as if each might finally crack the case wide open. The man who had once boarded Flight 305 with nothing but a briefcase of money and a plan had become a specter haunting the halls of the FBI, his identity a riddle that defied resolution. His legend growing with each passing year. The psychological portrait that emerged over decades painted Cooper as a man of precision and preparation, someone who understood systems, people, and the unpredictable nature of risk. He had executed the hijacking with an almost clinical calm, yet the audacity of his plan suggested a quiet audacity, a willingness to embrace danger while calculating every possible variable. Unlike typical criminals, he had not left a trail of violence or recklessness. Every action served a purpose. From the selection of the aircraft with its unique rear air stair to the exact instructions he gave the crew, Cooper demonstrated strategic foresight. Even the timing of his jump into darkness, rain, and cold reflected a knowledge of both physics and human expectation. Investigators noted that the crime required not only courage but mastery over one's environment, suggesting a life experience shaped by discipline, observation, and technical skill. Yet the enduring mystery of the Tina Bar money only deepened the enigma. The partial ransom, discovered nearly a decade after the hijacking, was neatly bundled, partially buried in sand, and remarkably preserved given the passage of time. It was at once proof of the crime and a tantalizing puzzle piece hinting at survival. Why only 3 bundles? How had they arrived there without scattering? Could Cooper have survived and intentionally stashed the cash, or had the river simply carried the money downstream in an unpredictable pattern? The condition of the bundles implied deliberate care, yet the absence of additional currency suggested that if Cooper had survived, he left nothing further behind. This fragment of evidence became a symbol of the case itself, tantalizing, incomplete, and impossible to fully explain. Even as modern technology advanced, the Cooper case remained beyond reach. DNA analysis, once a distant dream, was applied to evidence like the tie, but the results were inconclusive. Fingerprints had long since been exhausted. Flight simulations and topographical modeling offered insights into potential landing zones, but they could not definitively predict survival or identify the man himself. Every attempt to connect the dots exposed more uncertainties. The precision of Cooper's planning had created a scenario resistant to investigation, a crime that was engineered to leave questions rather than answers. In this way, he had outsmarted not only the authorities of 1971, but decades of evolving investigative methods, a ghost whose brilliance lay as much in vanishing as in stealing. The fascination surrounding Cooper also influenced the public imagination in profound ways. He became a symbol of audacious cunning, a man who had defied authority and disappeared completely. Stories, books, and documentaries examined his character, motives, and techniques. Some portrayed him as a Robin Hood figure of sorts, though there was little evidence of altruism. He had taken money, vanished, and left no trace of generosity. Others emphasized the technical mastery of his act, focusing on the combination of psychology, aviation knowledge, and calculated risk. In every retelling, Cooper's calm, measured demeanor became central, a quiet authority that enabled a remarkable escape. And in each retelling, the mystery endured, ensuring that his story would outlast the memories of those who had actually lived it. Speculation about Cooper's identity continued to flourish. The list of possible suspects included former military men, airline employees, engineers, and a handful of individuals with a precise combination of skills and opportunity. Investigators and enthusiasts analyzed life histories, habits, and patterns, attempting to match them to the behavioral profile derived from the hijacking. Many suspects were eliminated, some by alibi, others by lack of evidence, yet a few names lingered in the collective imagination, figures whose skills, temperament, and timing seemed eerily consistent with the known facts. Still, definitive proof never materialized. Cooper had engineered a perfect disappearance. He had left just enough evidence to confirm his crime, but none to confirm his identity. The end of the active FBI investigation in 2016 marked a turning point, but it was not a conclusion. The case remained a touchstone for law enforcement, aviation experts, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Cooper had reshaped the narrative of hijacking forever, inspiring procedural changes like the installation of the Cooper vane and altering perceptions of criminal audacity. Yet beyond these tangible legacies, he left something more elusive, a sense that human ingenuity, patience, and precision could defy conventional logic, leaving even decades of investigation unable to capture the truth. Cooper's story had become a psychological puzzle as much as a criminal one, a narrative where the interplay of skill, timing, and human behavior created an enduring mystery. And so, the legend of DB. Cooper remains suspended in time like the mist over the Columbia River on that cold November night. Was he alive when the first FBI teams began searching the forests? Did he watch from a distance as the country scrambled to find him? Or did he perish in the rain, leaving behind only fragments of money and memory? No answer has ever been found. Each generation continues to ask the same questions, analyze the same evidence, and imagine the impossible feat of a man who disappeared so completely. DB. Cooper's story is not merely a crime. It is a testament to the limits of human understanding, the allure of mystery, and the power of a carefully executed plan that can outlive its creator. And as long as the forests of Washington stand, the rivers flow, and the skies remain over the Pacific Northwest, one figure will continue to haunt them, unseen yet unforgettable. DB. Cooper, the man who vanished into legend, leaving behind a story that refuses to end, and a question that remains as chilling and compelling today as it did on that fateful night in November 1971. Even decades after the hijacking, the image of D.B. Cooper remained vivid in the collective imagination, a man who had vanished so completely that he had become as much myth as fact. Yet for investigators, the case remained stubbornly real, a puzzle that refused to be solved. In the years following the FBI's official closure of the case in 2016, enthusiasts, amateur detectives, and independent researchers continued to pore over every detail. From the flight logs and crew statements to the surviving pieces of evidence, the tie, the parachutes, and the money discovered at Tina Bar. Each new analysis, whether using digital modeling, computer simulations, or psychological profiling, seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Even modern forensics, with its ability to detect minute traces of DNA, chemical residues, or fabric fibers, yielded nothing definitive. Cooper had engineered a crime so carefully that the passage of time only seemed to reinforce his vanishing act. He was a man who had not merely escaped the law, but had eluded history itself. The Tina Bar money remained perhaps the most tantalizing clue. The neatly bundled bills, partially buried in sand and preserved remarkably well despite nearly a decade of exposure, raised more questions than they solved. Investigators debated endlessly. Had the money been buried intentionally, the cash left for later retrieval, or had it been carried downstream by the river's currents and somehow preserved intact? The scarcity of the bundles suggested selectivity. Why were only a few discovered, and where had the rest gone? Every analysis of the terrain, river flow, and possible landing sites produced competing theories. The money became both proof and enigma, tangible evidence of the crime, yet incapable of revealing the man behind it. It served as a reminder of Cooper's meticulous planning, his understanding of logistics, and perhaps his ability to anticipate not only the physical challenges of the jump, but the scrutiny that would follow in the decades ahead. Behavioral profiles remained central to understanding Cooper, even long after the original investigators had retired. Analysts examined his calm demeanor, the measured politeness with which he interacted with the crew, and the strategic nature of his commands. Cooper had exhibited a rare combination of technical skill, psychological insight, and risk tolerance. He had manipulated the environment with precision, choosing a Boeing 727 with a rear air stair, specifying flight altitudes and speeds, and controlling the crew's actions without resorting to violence beyond necessary threats. His knowledge of parachute mechanics and ability to jump safely into the dark, rainy night suggested prior experience, perhaps in military service or specialized civilian aviation. Each behavioral observation reinforced the notion that Cooper was not merely a criminal, but a calculated operator, a strategist who had understood the complex interplay between humans and machines. And chance. The list of potential suspects continued to evolve as amateur sleuths and independent investigators proposed theories based on occupation, physical description, and life events. Many were former military personnel with paratrooper training, airline employees with intimate knowledge of the Boeing 727, or engineers and mechanics with access to materials and equipment that could match the traces found on the tie or parachutes. Despite decades of investigation, no individual could be definitively linked to the hijacking. The challenge lay not only in identifying Cooper, but in explaining his complete disappearance. No sightings, no bank records linked to the marked ransom bills, and no personal connections had ever been confirmed. Cooper's ability to vanish entirely, leaving only fragments of a story behind, became the hallmark of his legend. The cultural fascination with Cooper persisted in books, documentaries, and popular media, where he was often portrayed as an anti-hero, a figure of ingenuity and daring. Unlike typical criminals, his crime carried no ideological message, no political statement, and no overt violence beyond the necessary measures to ensure compliance. Yet this very absence of motive beyond personal gain contributed to the intrigue. Cooper's actions were audacious, yes, but also disciplined, organized, and in some ways elegant. He had performed a crime with the precision of a chess player, anticipating moves and countermoves, minimizing risk, and ultimately achieving a vanishing act that left law enforcement and the public alike in awe. Even as technology advanced, from digital terrain modeling to high-resolution aerial mapping and forensic reconstruction, Cooper's fate remained unresolved. Simulations of the jump, even with modern understanding of aerodynamics and weather, yielded multiple plausible outcomes. He might have survived the treacherous conditions and escaped into the wilderness, eventually blending into society under a new identity. Or he might have perished shortly after the jump, leaving the river to carry some of the ransom to Tina Bar, and the rest lost to time. The uncertainty became part of the enduring fascination, a puzzle that required both imagination and analytical rigor. Ultimately, the enduring power of the DB. Cooper's story lies not in what was stolen or how he vanished, but in the brilliance of the act itself. He had executed a crime that challenged human ingenuity, law enforcement methods, and the limits of possibility. He had anticipated risk, manipulated his environment, and disappeared into legend. Each new generation that revisited the case brought fresh perspectives, renewed curiosity, and continued speculation. Cooper was a figure who transcended the crime, a man whose story illuminated the complexity of human planning, courage, and audacity. And so, as the rivers of the Pacific Northwest continue to wind through forests and valleys, and as the November winds whisper over cliffs and canyons, the question remains, haunting and unresolved. The diver. Cooper survived that stormy night, walking away into anonymity with his stolen fortune, or did he vanish forever into the darkness, leaving only fragments of evidence and a mystery that defies time? The story continues, an enduring enigma, a testament to human cunning, and a question that will never fully be answered. By the early 21st century, the legend of DB. Cooper had grown to a size almost as imposing as the man himself, a phantom figure suspended in the collective consciousness of investigators, historians, journalists, and thrill seekers. His story was no longer just a hijacking. It had evolved into an enduring puzzle, a study of precision, audacity, and human psychology. What struck people most was the perfection of the crime. He had boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in the late afternoon of November 24, 1971, carrying nothing but a briefcase, and in that ordinary act. He set into motion a chain of events that would reverberate for decades. There was an almost cinematic quality to it, a man dressed in a dark business suit, calm, polite, precise, issuing commands without panic. and ultimately disappearing into a stormy November sky with $200,000 in cash, equivalent to over $1.5 million today. Yet for all the glamour and intrigue that had grown around the story, the reality remained chillingly methodical. Cooper was not careless. Every decision he made was calculated, from the selection of the aircraft with its unique rear air stair to the specific instructions he gave the flight crew regarding speed, altitude, and timing. Each move suggested a deep understanding of mechanics, meteorology, and human behavior, a man who had clearly studied every variable and prepared for contingencies that would leave most people paralyzed with fear. The jump itself, perhaps the most audacious part of the entire plan, had long been a focus of debate and simulation. Modern recreations, employing sophisticated physics models and terrain mapping, suggest that the conditions Cooper faced were brutal. Darkness, cold rain, and near-freezing winds would have assaulted anyone attempting the jump without careful preparation. Trees, rivers, cliffs, and uneven terrain presented extreme hazards. Even minor errors, a misstep, a tangled parachute line, or misjudging the wind could have proven fatal. Yet Cooper's behavior in the moments leading up to the jump suggested both confidence and knowledge. He had deliberately chosen the rear air stair, an element unique to the 727, understanding that it allowed him the greatest chance to exit the plane undetected and to create the chaos necessary for his disappearance. He had timed the jump precisely, after the last fuel stop and over a stretch of sparsely populated land, minimizing the chance of immediate discovery. Investigators noted that no other hijacker of the era had demonstrated such foresight and calm under pressure. The combination of audacity and preparation was nearly unprecedented. The Tina Bar discovery in 1980 further complicated the narrative. The 3 bundles of $20 bills, partially buried along the Columbia River, were the first tangible evidence linking Cooper to the terrain outside the plane. The preservation of the money, given the decade-long exposure to weather and elements, suggested careful placement or extraordinary luck. Investigators debated endlessly whether the money had been dropped accidentally during the jump, buried intentionally by Cooper for later retrieval, or carried downstream by the river in an unusual but possible pattern. This single clue became both a key and a riddle, a fragment that simultaneously hinted at survival and suggested incompleteness. It raised additional questions. If Cooper had survived, why had he not recovered the money? If he had died during the jump, how had the river delivered the cash to that precise location? The mystery of Tina Bar became a touchstone for Cooper enthusiasts, a tangible piece of the puzzle that refused to fit neatly into any explanation. As decades passed, the FBI's investigative techniques evolved, yet Cooper remained just beyond reach. Technological advances, from DNA analysis to digital topography, offered new methods of examining the old evidence, but none produced definitive results. The tie left behind, analyzed under modern microscopes, revealed trace elements like titanium particles, hinting at a background in aerospace or industrial work, yet no match could be named. Fingerprints and DNA produced no conclusive identification. Flight simulations provided multiple scenarios for possible landing zones, yet the range of outcomes was vast, complicated by factors such as wind, rainfall, and terrain. Every new tool brought more insight, but also reinforced the impossibility of pinpointing Cooper's fate. He had engineered a disappearance that transcended conventional investigation, a vanishing act as precise as it was complete. Behavioral profiling of Cooper continued to fascinate investigators. His calm demeanor, strategic manipulation of the crew, and the deliberate selection of tools and procedures reflected an individual who understood risk and human psychology on a sophisticated level. Cooper was polite but commanding, careful but fearless, observant but efficient. Every gesture, the way he lit his cigarette, sipped his bourbon, and issued instructions, was calculated to maintain control and project confidence. Analysts speculated that he had extensive experience with high-stress situations, perhaps through military training, aviation work, or specialized civilian occupations. The selection of a dummy reserve parachute suggested a mix of cunning and perhaps psychological gamesmanship. An understanding that perception could be manipulated to minimize risk while maximizing control over outcomes. In this way, Cooper's intelligence extended beyond physical skill into strategy, demonstrating a rare ability to anticipate both immediate and long-term consequences. The cultural impact of Cooper also intensified. He became a symbol of audacity and intellect, an anti-hero whose story transcended crime. Movies, novels, and documentaries recounted his daring, his meticulous planning, and the mystery of his disappearance. Online communities proliferated, each theorist proposing new identities, survival theories, and landing zones. Amateur sleuths used modern technology to trace river flows, simulate parachute dynamics, and map the surrounding terrain, creating complex models that attempted to reconstruct Cooper's final moments. Yet no matter how sophisticated the analysis, the result was the same. The man remained unseen, his fate unresolved, and his identity unknown. Even the psychological allure of the case contributed to its endurance. Cooper had created a story in which human intellect triumphed over both circumstance and authority. He had not relied on brute force or chaos alone. He had carefully designed a sequence of actions that would allow him to vanish entirely. This deliberate, almost elegant approach made him unique among criminals, blending skill, daring, and strategy in a way that blurred the line between reality and legend. For every person who attempted to solve the case, Cooper represented the ultimate challenge, a reminder that human ingenuity, when combined with courage and careful planning, can create an outcome that defies time itself. As the story continued to be dissected, modeled, and theorized, one theme remained constant: the impossible audacity of the act. Cooper had hijacked a plane, demanded a ransom, jumped into the stormy night with minimal equipment, and left almost nothing behind. His disappearance had been total, his trail meticulously erased, his identity concealed in a way that confounded investigators for decades. And yet, for all the analysis, debate, and speculation, the case continued to inspire fascination. Cooper was no longer simply a criminal. He was a master of risk and mystery, a figure whose story defied conventional understanding, whose vanishing act became a timeless testament to human audacity and cunning. Even today, the forests, rivers, and hills of the Pacific Northwest carry the weight of his legend. The November winds whisper through the valleys, the Columbia River glints under moonlight, and the faint outlines of trees on steep cliffs evoke the memory of a man who stepped into the night and was never seen again. D.B. Cooper's story endures not because of the crime itself, but because of the perfection of the plan, the audacity of the execution, and the complete, haunting mystery of the disappearance. And as investigators, enthusiasts, and dreamers continue to speculate, one question remains ever present, chilling in its simplicity: did D.B. Cooper survive walking away into obscurity with his stolen fortune, or did he vanish forever into the cold, dark November night, leaving only fragments, rumors, and legend behind? The question lingers, unanswerable yet endlessly compelling, pulling all who hear it deeper into the mystery. Decades after the hijacking, the story of D.B. Cooper had transcended the boundaries of criminal investigation and entered the realm of folklore, legend, and cultural obsession. Yet beneath the layers of myth, the reality of the case remained stubbornly elusive, challenging the very best minds in law enforcement. The FBI had amassed thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, photographs, and forensic analyses, all meticulously cataloged, all pointing toward a single, undeniable truth. Cooper had vanished without a trace. Every lead, no matter how promising, eventually fizzled, leaving only questions in its wake. For investigators, the case was a study in patience, precision, and human behavior, a reminder that even the most calculated criminal act could elude the grasp of decades of scientific scrutiny and dogged determination. Central to the enduring mystery was Cooper himself. Behavioral experts have long marveled at the combination of confidence, planning, and psychological insight he displayed. He was polite, measured, and commanding, a man who understood how to assert authority without instilling panic. From the moment he handed the flight attendant the note demanding ransom, he maintained control, never raising his voice unnecessarily, never acting impulsively. His selection of the Boeing 727 with its rear air stair demonstrated an intimate understanding of aircraft mechanics, while the careful choice of flight instruction, altitude, speed, and trajectory suggested strategic planning designed to maximize the probability of survival. Every action, from the way he lit his cigarette to the way he handled the ransom money, reflected not recklessness, but precision. In essence, Cooper was more than a hijacker. He was a tactician, a man whose intellect allowed him to choreograph a crime that would leave authorities baffled for decades. The partially recovered ransom at Tina Bar continued to confound investigators and enthusiasts alike. The 3 bundles of $20 bills, neatly stacked and partially buried, provided a tangible connection to Cooper, yet revealed nothing about his fate. Some theorists speculated that Cooper had survived and intentionally buried the money as a safeguard, while others believed the river had carried it there naturally, creating an almost miraculous preservation. The scarcity of the recovered bills only deepened the intrigue. What had happened to the rest of the ransom? Had it been lost to the elements, buried in secret, or reclaimed by Cooper himself? Each scenario seemed plausible, yet none could be verified. The Tina Bar discovery became a symbol of the case itself, a fragment of truth shrouded in ambiguity, a clue that teased investigators with the promise of revelation, yet refused to satisfy. Modern investigative techniques, including computer simulations and DNA analysis, have provided new avenues for understanding the Cooper hijacking, but they have not cracked the case. Flight simulations have modeled every variable: airspeed, wind currents, precipitation, and terrain. These simulations show that survival was possible, yet highly challenging, requiring skill, preparation, and a degree of luck. DNA analysis of the tie and other remnants offered hints of possible industrial or aerospace backgrounds, yet no match has ever been confirmed. Cooper's disappearance was remarkable not only because of the audacity of the crime, but also because of the near-total absence of evidence regarding his identity and ultimate fate. The man engineered not only a theft, but a disappearance so complete that decades of technological advancement could not pierce the veil. The cultural fascination with DB. Cooper has grown in parallel with investigative efforts. He has been portrayed as a master criminal, a rogue anti-hero, and an almost mythic figure who represents intelligence, daring, and the ultimate challenge to authority. Films, books, and documentaries explore every conceivable angle: his possible identity, his motivations, the mechanics of the jump, and the enduring mystery of the ransom money. Amateur investigators, often armed with modern mapping tools and access to historical flight data, continue to propose new theories, reconstructing every detail of the night, simulating parachute jumps and attempting to trace his movements. Yet every hypothesis returns to the same chilling reality: Cooper's plan worked in total secrecy, leaving only questions and no answers. The psychological legacy of the case is as fascinating as the technical or investigative aspects. Cooper exemplified a rare type of criminal intellect, one that understood risk, human behavior, and the mechanics of the environment, then used that understanding to orchestrate an act of near-perfect precision. He did not rely on chaos or violence beyond necessity. He relied on calculation, preparation, and the manipulation of perception. His calm, deliberate manner demonstrated a mastery of both the physical and psychological realms, allowing him to achieve what most criminals could only dream of: a vanishing act that defied capture, explanation, and time itself. Even with all the analysis, speculation, and technological tools at their disposal, investigators and enthusiasts alike remain haunted by the same enduring question. Did Cooper survive the jump and escape into obscurity with his stolen fortune, or did he perish in the darkness, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and a legacy of mystery? Every simulation, every analysis of wind patterns, terrain, and flight mechanics, every psychological profile and behavioral observation points toward the same paradox. Cooper may have vanished without trace, yet he left an indelible mark on history, culture, and law enforcement. His story is a study in contrasts: planning and unpredictability, audacity and stealth, crime and legend. And so the Pacific Northwest, its forests, rivers, and cliffs, continues to guard the secret of D.B. Cooper. The wind over the Columbia River carries whispers of that fateful November night, while the rain and mist obscure the paths he may have taken. Every time investigators re-examine old evidence, every time enthusiasts recreate the jump or follow the possible flight path, the mystery deepens. DB. Cooper remains a figure both real and spectral, a man whose intellect and courage allowed him to execute one of the most remarkable crimes in American history and then vanish entirely, leaving a legacy of suspense, fascination, and unanswered questions that continues to captivate the world. And as night falls over the rivers, forests, and valleys where he may have landed, the question that began in 1971 continues to echo: where did DB Cooper go, and did he survive to see the world continue on without ever being found? The answer remains out of reach, suspended in time, an eternal shadow over the Pacific Northwest that refuses to be solved. By now, the legend of DB Cooper had become inseparable from the very fabric of American crime history, a story that fascinated generations not merely because of the money stolen, but because of the man's complete disappearance into the night. Every detail of that November evening in 1971 had been dissected, debated, and dramatized countless times, yet the image of Cooper remained elusive, a ghost in the fog of history. What made the story enduring, beyond the audacity of the crime itself, was the almost surgical precision with which he executed it. He had entered Flight 305 as just another passenger, unassuming in appearance, blending into the crowd, yet he carried with him a plan that would challenge law enforcement for decades. Every instruction he gave the crew was calculated to maintain control, manage risk, and prevent panic. He understood the aircraft, the mechanics of the jump, and the psychology of those on board. Unlike other criminals who act impulsively, Cooper had orchestrated each step with the kind of foresight that bordered on genius. His calm, polite demeanor, paired with strategic demands, created an air of authority that forced compliance without unnecessary conflict, a psychological mastery few investigators could ignore. The jump itself, which has fascinated experts and thrill seekers alike for decades, was a feat of both courage and technical skill. The weather that night, dark clouds, cold rain, and gusty winds over the Pacific Northwest, created a challenge that was perilous even for experienced paratroopers. Investigators recreated the jump repeatedly using dummies, computer models, and modern GPS mapping, attempting to predict landing zones and assess survival odds. Every simulation underscored the danger. Trees could snag lines, cliffs could break a fall, rivers could sweep away even the strongest swimmer, and hypothermia loomed as a constant threat. Yet the most remarkable aspect was Cooper's apparent mastery of these variables. He had chosen the aircraft with the rear air stair, understood how to deploy the parachutes effectively, and timed the exit with precision, all while ensuring that the crew remained calm and the flight path was optimal for his escape. The man had thought through every detail with a meticulousness that was almost unprecedented, blending risk-taking with planning in a way that would leave law enforcement baffled for decades. Then there was the discovery of the Tina Bar money, nearly a decade later, which added a layer of mystery that no amount of analysis could fully unravel. The 3 bundles of $20 bills, partially buried in sand along the Columbia River, were at once proof of the crime and a puzzle that refused to be solved. Some investigators speculated that Cooper had survived and intentionally stashed the cash, returning to retrieve it later but never doing so. Others suggested that the river had naturally carried the bundles to that location, preserving them against the odds. Whatever the explanation, the scarcity of the recovered money, combined with the absence of any additional traces, reinforced the impossibility of truly understanding what happened after the jump. Each new piece of evidence seemed to confirm the brilliance of Cooper's planning, while simultaneously deepening the uncertainty about his fate. Despite decades of technological advancement, including DNA testing, digital reconstruction, and aerial modeling, Cooper remained invisible. The tie left behind, once analyzed under modern forensic methods, suggested industrial or aerospace exposure, but no match could be made. Fingerprints and other traces yielded nothing. Flight simulations showed multiple possible landing zones, yet each presented extreme risk, and no credible sightings ever confirmed a survivor. Cooper had created a crime that not only succeeded in the moment, but had been engineered to remain unsolvable over time. His disappearance was a masterstroke of foresight, audacity, and calculated risk, a man who not only executed a perfect crime, but had mastered the art of vanishing completely. Culturally, Cooper became more than a criminal. He became a symbol, a narrative of daring, intelligence, and mystery that fascinated writers, filmmakers, and enthusiasts alike. Movies and novels portrayed him as an anti-hero, a figure who had outsmarted authorities and disappeared without leaving a trace. Online communities and amateur investigators continued to analyze the details, proposing new theories about his identity, methods, and ultimate fate. Each theory, while imaginative, returned to the same frustrating reality. Cooper had disappeared without trace, leaving only fragments of evidence, a partial ransom, and a legend that grew with each passing year. His story was now a psychological puzzle as much as a criminal one, a case study in intelligence, risk, and human behavior that continues to challenge experts and inspire fascination. The story of D.B. Cooper also underscores a broader truth about human nature: the allure of mystery, the fascination with audacity, and the persistent desire to solve what seems unsolvable. His crime was not merely about money. It was about control, intellect, and the ability to operate under pressure with absolute precision. Cooper understood how to manipulate both circumstance and perception, creating a situation in which he could achieve his objective and vanish entirely. In doing so, he left behind a narrative that continues to capture the imagination of the public. A man who dared to challenge authority, calculated every risk, and disappeared into the night, leaving the world to wonder about his fate. And so the forests, rivers, and hills of the Pacific Northwest remain silent witnesses to Cooper's audacious act. The cold November air, the rushing waters of the Columbia, and the dense mist that draped the landscape all conceal the ultimate truth, keeping it locked away as a secret only Cooper could have known. Every simulation, every theory, every speculative investigation serves to reinforce the enormity of what was achieved that night. A crime executed with precision, courage, and planning so complete that no one has ever been able to solve it. The story is not merely one of theft, but of ingenuity, risk, and the enduring power of a carefully executed disappearance. And as the legend persists, one question continues to haunt both investigators and dreamers alike: did D.B. Cooper survive the treacherous night and vanish into obscurity, enjoying the fruits of his audacity, or did he perish in the storm, leaving behind only fragments of his plan, the partial ransom, and an enduring mystery that refuses to be solved? The answer remains unknown, suspended in time, a shadow over the Pacific Northwest that continues to challenge the imagination and keep the world enthralled. Even now, nearly half a century after that fateful night, the story of D.B. Cooper has not faded. It has only deepened, taking on the qualities of myth while remaining grounded in fact. The man who walked onto Flight 305 with nothing more than a briefcase, a calm demeanor, and an audacious plan had changed the way the world thought about crime, risk, and human ingenuity. To this day, the image of Cooper, polite, precise, and unflinching, remains vivid in the minds of those who study him, a symbol of calculated daring that borders on the impossible. For law enforcement, he is a case study in both triumph and frustration, a crime executed with such perfection that no amount of investigation, technological advancement, or theoretical modeling has been able to provide closure. For the public, he is an icon of audacity, a reminder that a single individual, armed with intelligence, courage, and meticulous planning, can challenge the very structures of authority and emerge into legend. The Columbia River, the forests of Washington, and the cliffs and valleys over which Cooper leapt that stormy November night remain silent witnesses to the event. Investigators have mapped every possible landing site, reconstructed the jump countless times, and analyzed environmental variables ranging from wind speed to river currents. Yet each model produces more possibilities than certainties, underscoring the genius of Cooper's disappearance. He had not merely stolen money. He had stolen the very certainty of law enforcement, leaving behind a scenario where the outcome could be imagined endlessly but never confirmed. The Tina Bar money, recovered in fragments years later, offered tantalizing hints but never told the full story, each bundle a whisper from the past, suggesting survival or carefully orchestrated concealment. It is a reminder that Cooper's planning extended beyond the hijacking itself, accounting for a world he would never rejoin, a world that would chase him for decades without success. The psychological portrait of D.B. Cooper has been scrutinized by professionals and enthusiasts alike. He displayed characteristics rarely seen together: audacity tempered by caution, intelligence paired with patience, and an understanding of human behavior that allowed him to manipulate the flight crew without resorting to unnecessary force. Cooper's calm demeanor under immense pressure suggests prior experience with high-stakes situations, military service, aviation training, or other specialized fields, and his ability to blend risk with precision elevated him beyond ordinary criminal profiles. He was, in many ways, the perfect orchestrator, a man who recognized the limitations of others, anticipated their reactions, and operated in a space where he controlled nearly every variable. His disappearance was the final proof of his methodical brilliance. Culturally, Cooper's story has taken on a life of its own. He has inspired novels, documentaries, films, podcasts, and countless online theories, each exploring possible identities, survival scenarios, and the mechanics of his jump. Amateur sleuths have mapped potential landing zones, retraced rivers, simulated jumps, and even tracked wind patterns in an attempt to uncover what Cooper had done that night. Yet every attempt, no matter how sophisticated, has returned to the same unresolved truth: Cooper vanished without trace. The fascination endures because the case represents a perfect confluence of intellect, audacity, and mystery. He is at once a criminal, a strategist, and a legend, a figure whose story is both real and mythic, grounded in the precise details of a crime and elevated by the impossibility of his disappearance. The enduring allure of D.B. Cooper also lies in the broader human fascination with the unknown. His crime challenges assumptions about risk, control, and capability. It invites speculation not just about his identity, but about human potential, what it means to plan meticulously, to act boldly, and to leave behind a problem that cannot be solved. Cooper's hijacking was not merely an act of theft. It was a demonstration of foresight, strategy, and the capacity to operate under extreme conditions. He leveraged human psychology, environmental variables, and technical knowledge to create a scenario that no one could fully unravel, a feat that continues to captivate investigators and storytellers alike. Even as the years pass and technology advances, the mystery of D.B. Cooper remains intact. The FBI files, once a symbol of persistent investigation, now serve as historical records of both the crime and the pursuit, a testament to human curiosity and determination. Yet despite all efforts, the final chapter remains unwritten. Did Cooper survive the treacherous jump, disappearing into the forests and rivers of the Pacific Northwest to live out a quiet life with his stolen fortune? Or did he perish, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, a partial ransom, and a legend that would endure far beyond his time? Every theory carries weight, every clue sparks imagination, but no answer has ever been definitive. And so, the story of D.B. Cooper ends not with resolution, but with the same haunting question that has persisted for over 50 years. His act was audacious, precise, and ultimately successful in the most extraordinary way. He vanished completely, leaving only whispers, fragments, and speculation. He became a symbol of calculated daring, a reminder that human intelligence and courage can, in rare instances, outmatch the systems designed to contain them. The forests, rivers, and cliffs of the Pacific Northwest still stand as silent witnesses, carrying the memory of a man who dared to challenge the world and disappear entirely. D.B. Cooper remains, in the truest sense, a mystery without end, a shadow over history, a ghost in the wind, and a testament to the extraordinary power of human planning and ingenuity. And perhaps that is why, even now, over 50 years later, his story continues to captivate, to mystify, and to inspire the same mixture of awe, curiosity, and wonder that it did on that cold November night in 1971, leaving the world to ask over and over again, who was D.B. Cooper and what truly became of him?